Welcome to the dark future of the new United States, land of the cyberpunks and home to the frighteningly militarized, well, everything. Government, police, corporations, gangs, nomads, just about everyone's packing here, and life is cheap. When the Cyberpunk tabletop game was released in 1989, it was principally focused on the Night City setting. In fact, as I understand it, in the first edition, Night City was supposed to be a sort of generic cyberpunk urban filter that could be overlaid onto any city in America, so that people running games could set their games in their own hometowns or wherever, rather than a specific place. It was an every city has a Night City type of thing. It only really got fully developed into a location in its own right with its own history in the second edition, Cyberpunk 2020. There was demand to provide a more fleshed-out vision of what the rest of the country was like. Hence this 1992 Sourcebook, The Home of the Brave, which delves into the subject in great detail and is the source for most of the information in this video for the 2020 setting, though I will go into what's going on in the 2045 setting and the 2077 setting. I'm also dipping into the NeoTribes sourcebook for information about the Nomad Nations and taking a few tidbits from the Land of the Free campaign book. There are some discrepancies between how Home of the Brave and the Cyberpunk Red core book describe the 2020 setting, but I'm leaning on Home of the Brave because it has a lot more detailed information. Then I'll be drawing from the Cyberpunk Red core book for information on the 2045 setting. The Edgerunners mission kit for Red, the World of Cyberpunk 2077 lorebook, and the Cyberpunk 2077 game are my sources for the 2077 setting. Remembering that Cyberpunk takes place in an alternate timeline from our own that diverged at the start of the 90s, let's start by laying the groundwork for the dark future. I provided a real history primer for my East Asia video, so I'll do the same here in brief. So, World War II, a massive and extremely complicated global conflict I don't have the time or inclination to go into detail about, whose aftermath saw the decline of old empires and the rise of two new global superpowers from the winning side. In Europe, the Soviet Union consolidated its territorial gains from the war to bolster its economy and provide support to friendly communist states, a process it continued by lending support to communist regimes and revolutionaries around the world. In North America, the United States underwent an economic boom from basically being the only major industrialized country whose domestic production was untouched by the war, and quickly leveraged its allies and influence to counter communist expansion and expand its own influence. Thus the Cold War began, characterized by two powers that viewed each other as existential threats that dare not directly confront one another for fear of nuclear war. That's an oversimplified explanation, to be sure, but I'm giving the bare minimum needed to explain what the situation is in the early cyberpunk timeline. Over the course of the Cold War, the government of the United States created and empowered various agencies dedicated to executing operations against its enemies abroad and rooting out those at home. They had access to vast resources and black budgets, and their activities were a mystery even to most government officials. In the Cyberpunk timeline, those agencies congealed into an informal alliance known as the Gang of Four, a cabal composed of the CIA, NSA, DEA, and the FBI in the period following World War II. By the 1990s, the Gang of Four had amassed vast political and military power that it would use to drive American policy toward their own objectives, effectively forming a shadow government that operated outside their legal bounds. The NSA in particular was spying on virtually every form of communication or transaction in the United States, and quite a few abroad, well beyond their mandate. We're fully on the Cyberpunk timeline now, but so far, it isn't exactly far-fetched. After the Soviet Union collapsed as a geopolitical rival in 1989, though it did ultimately survive in a reduced form in this timeline, a rift began to grow between the United States and its allies in Europe. Those allies had recently created and joined the European Economic Community, a bloc that the Gang of Four in particular viewed as a threat to American global influence. Thus they began a covert campaign known as the Quiet War, a series of aggressive efforts to suppress the European Economic Community's growing influence that only deepened the rift between the former allies as the EEC retaliated. Distaste for overreaching American foreign policy in Europe intensified with tariffs and other policies harming American business interests. Paranoid isolationism became the norm of American politics. The relationship hit a breaking point in 1992 when the EEC started providing humanitarian and economic aid to failing Soviet states, despite the United States doing its best to prevent any such aid. Those Soviet states accepted use of the new European currency, the Eurodollar, and soon established cordial relationships with the European Economic Community. With the declining threat of the Soviet Union rendering American military protection irrelevant, European countries soon began withdrawing from the NATO alliance, which collapsed in short order. The European Space Agency also took actions to further the bloc's orbital influence. Around the same time, the American Drug Enforcement Agency tried to end the war on drugs by spreading designer plagues targeting coca plants throughout South America. This led to the full-on collapse of governments in Chile and Ecuador, along with the breakout of a vicious war between drug lords and the forces of the DEA as various other nations destabilized. American forces were deployed in the name of restoring order. The Americans sent in cutting-edge cyber soldiers and weapons to combat the drug cartels across Central and South America, only to run into fierce resistance from both the cartels and partisan forces whose local economies were dependent on the drug trade. Yes, cybernetics were developed in the early 1990s in this timeline. Effectively, this was the government using soldiers as a test bed for what would later be called Gen 1 cyberware, using mind-machine interfaces developed by university researchers and newly developed synthetic muscle fibers. Corporations would refine these proofs of concepts into Gen 2 cyberware in the coming years, which would quickly proliferate the world over. As far as the war, though, the Americans hadn't learned the lessons of Vietnam and so quickly became bogged down in dense Central and South American jungles. European corporations actually provided backing to the drug lords in this conflict as a continuation of the Quiet War between Europe and the US. This conflict would be remembered in the States as the First South American War. You might see it mentioned as the First Central American War in the lore sometimes, but as far as I can tell, almost all the fighting was in distinctly South American countries. The climax of that struggle was actually on US soil, however, the detonation of a nuclear bomb in Rockefeller Center, New York City, a blast that killed 15,000 people. We're still in 1993, we haven't even gotten to the worst of it. Already, poverty and homelessness was increasing dramatically as the conflict with Europe and the drug lords took its toll, not to mention the destruction of one of the world's biggest financial hubs in New York City. Strife with the federal government grew so bad that some states started considering leaving the Union and withholding taxes. The Gang of Four responded to withheld federal taxes in California by sending in paramilitary forces to seize control of San Francisco, leading to fighting in the city. When the National Guard sided with the locals, the paramilitaries tried to take the state capital, Sacramento, under the auspices of the federal government, leading to the governor rejecting the supremacy of federal authority. The military refused the Gang of Four's orders to participate in the conflict. This would be the start of the Free State movement that Texas would formally kick off a few years later. Then the world stock crash of 1994 happened. You see, one of the ways the Gang of Four tried to undermine the European economic community was to manipulate the stock market. Specifically, the NSA hacked stock markets in Europe and Asia to exaggerate the performance of American stocks and encourage favorable exchange rates. When the European authorities uncovered this, they simply revealed it to the public. The result was absolutely catastrophic. Confidence in the world's largest economy vanished overnight, and most developed countries enacted embargoes against American trade. The damage reverberated around the globe, but in the United States, it heralded a near-total societal collapse. The slump into severe economic depression was immediate. Federal bonds were being bought at such a pace that the government had to print vast amounts of money to purchase them, leading to runaway inflation. Businesses collapsed and many municipal governments declared bankruptcy in the years that followed. Employment dried up along with the pensions and investments older Americans relied on. Many small towns and cities were abandoned entirely as their economies withered to nothing. A significant number of people were forced to band together to support one another and their families in a nomadic lifestyle, seeking work where they could find it. These would eventually form the first nomad clans. Others turned to crime as the first booster gangs began to appear, gangs that used drugs and later cybernetics to enhance their capacity for violence. The people grew so infuriated with the government's failure to deal with the social crisis that rioting mobs lynched hundreds of criminal defense attorneys across the country. A man called Richard Knight out in California started building a city from scratch around this time, and the chaos was bad enough that he managed to get some major corporate backing to create what would hopefully be an island of security. We won't be focusing on Night City much here, but you can check out my deep dive if you're interested. Now, remember, the most powerful force in government at this time is the Gang of Four, and their guiding philosophy was really just extreme paranoia. Well, eventually they came around to viewing the rest of the government as a threat to their power as well. Thus, in 1996, the NSA orchestrated the assassination of President Richard Allen and Vice President Harold Hunt at campaign stops in California and Maine, respectively, casting blame on corporate plots to control the country. The line of succession would have normally placed the Speaker of the House and then the pro tempore of the Senate next in line, but the former was incapacitated while undergoing bypass surgery, and the latter refused the position, evidently fearing he would be killed next. Thus, Secretary of Defense Jonathan Seward became acting president. In his first act, he suspended the Constitution and declared martial law, transferring authority to an interim military government. The military was deployed nationwide to keep rampant rioting and looting from tearing the nation apart. Military governors took charge of the country in newly formed military districts for several years, commanding a host of military units from every branch of service. They ultimately contained the worst of the anarchy, but the brutality with which they did so imprinted a strongly negative view of the military as dictatorial thugs that has endured in the new America. In the halls of power, a covert game of cat and mouse ensued as the new government unknowingly butted heads with the Gang of Four, who now viewed the military government as a threat to their power. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs organized various military intelligence services into MIC, the Military Intelligence Cooperative, formed from experienced military intelligence operatives and deliberately isolated from the existing non-military intelligence apparatus so their findings could not be manipulated. This was to try and trace the actions of the cabal that they only now were becoming aware of. The Gang of Four understood that they had been discovered and actively interfered with the MIC, much to the detriment of American influence abroad. In 1997, a war broke out between Iran and Iraq in the Middle East. U.S. military assets in the region were targeted, and the NSA withheld critical intelligence, resulting in the total destruction of American military assets in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The NSA made excuses, but this event prompted President Seward to formally open an investigation into the Gang of Four agencies. Around this time, the United States government began withdrawing from many of its military commitments abroad, sparking war in places like the Korean Peninsula that had relied on its security backing. It isn't stated directly in the lore, but American withdrawal probably contributed to events that played out next in the Middle East. I certainly doubt it had a stabilizing effect, especially as far as the Iran-Iraq conflict or Israel is concerned. That Iran-Iraq conflict escalated alarmingly. You see, American entanglements in the region didn't intensify in the Cyberpunk timeline the same way they did in ours, because later in 1997, several nuclear-armed Middle Eastern and North African countries engaged in a cascading exchange of nuclear fire, remembered as the Mideast Meltdown. By 2077, it was being called the Suicide War. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Chad, and the Arab Emirates were all but completely destroyed. The only countries to come out relatively intact were Egypt, Syria, and Israel, though even they were left in a ruined state. Storms would carry radioactive dust to Europe, Asia, and Africa for decades to come, with a vast flow of refugees streaming from the region in the immediate aftermath. This also had the effect of cutting the global oil supply in half, so you can imagine that didn't help the global economic crisis any. Shortly after this, it became apparent to the military government that the CIA, NSA, FBI, and the DEA had been conspiring illegally for some time. but they struggled to effectively root out the corruption. Also, there was a disaster at a more regional level. A toxic spill in the Pacific Northwest wiped out the salmon populations, bringing further economic and ecological devastation. The 90s weren't done sucker punching the American people. It seemed like God wanted to get a few licks in too. The drought of '98 in the Midwest reduced much of the region to parched grasslands and nearly destroyed American agriculture, leading to food shortages. Then later in the same year, an earthquake registering at 10.5 on the Richter scale hit Los Angeles, causing the ocean to flood 35% of the city and killing 65,000 people. The sources don't say, but I imagine that was not a fun time for the rest of the West Coast either. On the bright side, diplomacy had managed to lift some of the trade embargoes on the American economy, so there was now a chance at recovery. 1999 would also see the consequences of weakening American unity and further challenges to the federal structure of the nation. It happened in Texas. The Midwest drought actually brought a lot of money to Texas due to its extensive food production, as well as a lot of money being invested in oil, seen as one of the few safe investments at the time. However, the federal government increased its tax burden in response, and thus many Texans actually had less spending power than before. That made Texans disgruntled with the federal government, but the breaking point was a federal weapons regulation bill. Overnight, the state legislature adopted the Ross Bill, challenging the supremacy of federal law over the states and declaring the weapon bill invalid within Texas state borders. This was a challenge to federal power unseen since the Civil War over 100 years prior, and the military government moved to respond with force. However, Texas had a lot of economic power. The state cut off interstate shipping of oil, gas, food, and electronics, not to mention stalling the space program. Texan banks also froze national assets. Then Alaska joined in, passing their own version of the Ross Bill and taking similar actions against the federal government. The military government was stretched very thin by the various crises going on already. Going to war with two economically powerful states was too much, but neither could they allow the states to secede without irrevocably breaking the Union. Instead, negotiators went in, and the Free State system was created as a compromise. The Free States would have varying degrees of autonomy from the federal government, but remain part of the United States. They made their own trade agreements, decided which federal laws to follow, no longer sent federal taxes to the government, and effectively seized military assets within their own borders to create state militaries. Alaska and Texas would soon back California in declaring itself a free state within a few years. Utah would follow, and Nevada was apparently able to buy its free state status from the federal government for an unknown sum. Anyway, back in 1999, the federal government officially ended martial law, though in practice the military was still running the government. Millennium cults ran wild with an orgy of violence in the months leading up to the turn of the millennium, culminating in mass suicide events on January 1st, 2000. If you're interested in a tally of the damage caused by the collapse at this point, the economic destruction and rising societal violence is estimated to have killed 100 million people in the United States by the year 2000. Well over a third of the country's 1990 population had died over the course of the past decade. Up to 50 million had become nomads or otherwise homeless. The tax-paying population amounted to about 120 million according to the military government census. Later in 2000, a disease remembered as the wasting plague ripped through both Europe and the States, which was largely ignored by the government in the general chaos of the country, killing a total of 14 million people across both continents before a Japanese vaccine made it to market. Essentially, the experience of the United States in this timeline from 1990 until the early 2000s was just a series of cataclysmically awful events, some caused by the government and others by acts of God, all resulting in the gutting of the American economy and near total collapse of society. It's a bit ironic. When you introduce people to Cyberpunk, the assumption I usually see is to blame the corporations for what's happened to the world. But it actually seems unaccountable rogue government agencies with limitless budgets caused the original problems. The megacorporations just exploited the aftermath. There were some positive developments in 2001 as the net came into being. As in the real world, the introduction of this world's version of the internet dramatically changed how corporations do business, and some American companies were able to get a foothold to pull themselves out of the collapse. In 2002, a worldwide crisis called the food crash occurred with the proliferation of a virus that destroyed wheat crops worldwide. Except in the United States, where corporations developed a counteragent and new resistant wheat strains. This provided a much-needed boost to American agriculture, but there were a lot of accusations from Europe and the Soviets that the US had manufactured the crisis. No evidence of American or even the Gang of Four's involvement in creating or spreading the virus has ever emerged. The conflict between the military government and the Gang of Four continued, however. In 2002, the NSA and the CIA orchestrated the assassination of acting President Seward, though officially he was killed randomly in a riot. General William Newell, the same chairman of the Joint Chiefs that created the MI6, stepped in to lead the country as acting head of state. The Gang of Four turned their attention south, once again to securing land and U.S. commercial interests in Central and South America under the guise of combating the drug trade. They believed that with some modicum of civil order returning on the domestic front and new advances in cyber soldiery, the time was ripe to destroy the drug lords that had previously defied them. At this time, though, most narcotics sold in the U.S. were actually synthesized domestically. The drug war was just justification for a naked land grab. Just as importantly, they hoped the military government would be too distracted by the war to effectively combat the gang on the home front, and they might gain some supporters through a quick, successful war. Thus, CIA-funded paramilitary units instigated the war in 2003, leading to the U.S. invasion of Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The Second South American War had begun and would prove to be a catastrophe, costing thousands of American lives to no benefit over almost 8 years. Once again, European powers threw their support behind the drug lords and South American governments, providing material and even recruiting neo-Soviet military advisors. Effectively, it became a struggle for domination of the hemisphere as the U.S. poured more and more assets into the conflict. On the home front, the military was stretched thin, containing civil unrest and sending forces to South America, but the war only delayed the destruction of the Gang of Four by about a year. Acting leader of the country, General Newell, a former Green Beret, used his contacts among the special forces to solicit testimony that revealed much of the extent of the gang's operations, in particular the NSA's involvement in the assassination of over a dozen high-level officials, including the late President Seward. Thus, the military was dispatched to purge government agencies. The FBI and the DEA were quickly disbanded. The CIA and the NSA were also dismantled, or at least reduced to shells of their former selves, but elements of the NSA would continue to elude capture and operate in secret until 2008. In 2006, a new federal intelligence agency, the FIA, would be established to take over the former functions of the CIA and NSA, but trust in the intelligence community was so low that it would remain an underfunded and marginal organization for decades. In 2005, following the effective destruction of the Gang of Four, the military government was confident enough that the immediate threat to civil governance was past that they decided to ease back military control and give authority to a civilian leader. They weren't confident enough to hold elections, but they appointed a civilian president, Henry Jacoby. President Jacoby was promptly assassinated within a year, but not by shady intelligence operatives. Instead, the assassination was traced to a corporation, Mantoga Incorporated. The military government decided to make an example out of Mantoga to put other megacorporations on notice that the American military machine would not tolerate this sort of interference. The company was given a 4-hour warning to pull all assets and personnel out of the states or face total destruction. When time was up, Operation Big Stick commenced. Every Mantoga office in the country was destroyed by surgical airstrikes. Every factory and storage facility was immediately overrun by the army. Covert military operatives took care of the rest. The operation was considered a success with the assassination of the last Mantoga executive in Germany a year later. The military sent a clear message to the corporations, but plans to return civilian governance and federal elections were pushed back several years. In South America, the biggest battles were finished with the Gang of Four no longer pushing American involvement from behind the scenes, but the conflict continued to drag on at a low level for years with sporadic firefights between the Americans and local forces. The military government was presumably still trying to get something for all the resources they'd invested in the war, and they wanted to rebuild American international prestige in some way. The EEC was really the big world power at this point, but nobody in the American government wanted to admit that. On another front, the United States Aerospace Force began investing more and more in space, putting kill satellites and battle stations in orbit to create a foothold in an area that had increasingly become dominated by the European Space Agency and Neo-Soviet Union orbital assets. In particular, the ESA was finishing construction of the Crystal Palace, a large orbital habitat, and had already established a lunar colony by this time. A UN treaty allowed the salvaging of any unidentified object in space as a potential orbital hazard, and military satellites were generally unidentified as a matter of security, so the US and Neo-Soviet Union began a sort of malicious compliance war by salvaging one another's military satellites. Damages and injuries from these operations mounted, and opposing patrol craft started exchanging weapons fire when they passed. This crisis came to a head in 2008 when the US launched a surprise attack on the largest Neo-Soviet military battle station, Mir 13. What followed was 6 hours of exchanged hostilities in orbit between the Neo-Soviets and the Americans, which ended abruptly when the ESA intervened on behalf of its ally. The ESA lunar colony Tycho used its mass driver to launch a 2-ton rock targeting the North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs. The city was completely destroyed, killing tens of thousands at a minimum and decapitating the American Aerospace Command. This would prove a defining moment for a figure that would become particularly important to the nation's history, a young Colonel Elizabeth Kress. She commanded a unit in NORAD but was returning from vacation when the rock hit. Just 3 miles outside the city, her car was blown off the road and Kress was deafened by the blast wave. When she came to, Colonel Kress found herself the highest-ranking surviving officer of the United States Aerospace Force. Her role in the crisis response after recovering and rebuilding higher command afterward earned her a lot of popularity among the public as the Lady from NORAD, though she retired from the military shortly after. We'll come back to her in a bit. The ESA also dropped a rock on a jointly operated base in Australia, Pine Gap, but they actually missed and instead obliterated the nearby town of Alice Springs. These attacks would not fully deter American ambitions in space, as a year later, in 2009, terrorists who were later found to have been funded by the states attempted a takeover of the Crystal Palace. It failed, but the ESA dropped 2 more rocks off the coast of Washington, D.C. and Tampa as a warning. Around this time, the military would start stationing nuclear submarines off the coast of Europe as deterrents against further rock attacks. The destruction of Colorado Springs may have been a bit of a wake-up call for the military government that they couldn't continue like this, because in the same year they announced a return of elections and civilian government. In 2008, Americans would have an elected leader for the first time in over a decade. Also in this year, the intercontinental maglev project was completed, connecting the country from coast to coast. In 2009, with a newly elected civilian government, the US started trying to right some mistakes in terms of its diplomatic situation. The relationship with European powers was pretty badly burned at both ends at this point, so instead they turned to Asia, building stronger ties with Japan and signing a mutual defense treaty with China. In 2010, the US would finally give up on its military adventurism in South America, bringing the Second South American War to a close with a whimper after the better part of a decade. The only territory the US really got out of the conflict was a heavily militarized zone around the Panama Canal. By this time, the Panama Canal and Guam are the only overseas territory the United States continues to hold. However, the withdrawal would come with tragedies of its own. The understaffed military had resorted to hiring over 1 million civilian contractors to augment their forces, most of them skilled but unemployed nomads and similar individuals. The new Congress instituted major budget cuts to control spending and failed to provide transportation for most of those contractors, leaving them stranded in Panama and Colombia. They had to find their way back to the states themselves, surrounded by unfriendly partisans, many of whom had spent the better part of a decade fighting Americans. The infamous Nomad Long Walk of 2010 and 2011 had a higher casualty count of the American military during the whole war. Many gave up on returning to the states and formed new nomad clans in Mexico or joined coastal pirate groups. Only about 10% had made it back to the states by 2012. Disaster would also strike the city of Chicago in 2012. The city had been hit hard by the collapse already, but in 2012 a plague was unleashed on the city. Turns out the city was actually home to a facility that produced a lot of biological and chemical warfare research for the federal government before it was abandoned due to dated infrastructure and costs. Certain samples were not properly disposed of. The facility was uncovered during demolition work at the city of Chicago, and some of these materials were accidentally released, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,700 people and the evacuation of the whole city, which rapidly fell into disrepair. A restoration project would be undertaken several years later. The same year was a time of unrest in California. The Los Angeles Metroplex had grown to monstrous proportions, covering the coasts from Santa Barbara to San Diego and stretching as far inland as San Bernardino. The region dominated state politics, something its northern neighbors were increasingly unhappy with. The counties of Northern California voted to secede and form a new state. After a brief interstate war, a new border was drawn, creating the Free State of Northern California and the Free State of Southern California, NorCal and SoCal for short. Federal acknowledgement of the new states came in 2016. In 2013, the US and the EEC showed at least some willingness to cooperate by signing a treaty to jointly create NetWatch, a global cyber-policing organization created to address the proliferation of digital crime since the creation of the net just over a decade earlier. The newer lore says that NetWatch was a pre-existing British security company founded in 1991, which was transformed into an international agency in 2013 by the treaty. The agency's activities are heavily sponsored by corporations that engage its services to protect their data fortresses. The remainder of the decade was actually pretty uneventful, a time of slow but encouraging economic recovery for the country and its institutions. Presidents came and went, as it seems a peaceful transfer of power had been restored. Elizabeth Kress re-entered the public eye to start a political career, first serving a single term as senator for Colorado, and then joining President Blair's successful ticket, being sworn in as vice president in 2017. The president became deathly ill and died in 2018, leaving Kress as the acting president. So the United States would go into the 2020s with its first woman president. So now I'll be diving a bit deeper into the 2020 setting. We'll start with a look at the government and military, then move on to some culture and society developments, a discussion of the nomad clans, before finally going through a survey of various regions of the country. After that, we'll move into the Fourth Corporate War and the time of the Red. The shape of the United States government had changed a lot by 2020 in this universe. Presidents are being elected again, but the election is carried out by the Senate. There's still a popular vote in each state to inform the senators of their state's choice, and the number of senators has changed. If you don't know much about the structure of the American national government, it's split into three branches: executive, being led by the office of the president, judicial, and legislative. The legislative branch has two houses: the Senate, in which each state gets 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, in which each state gets a number of representatives proportional to their population. In Cyberpunk, this structure has been radically reformed over the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The House of Representatives is no more. partially because nobody has been able to get an accurate population census completed in almost 2 decades. Instead, only the Senate holds the power of the legislative branch, but it has been modified. Each state has 3 senators, 2 that represent the 2 largest cities in the state, and 1 to represent the largest corporate taxpayer in that state. Yes, the corporations literally have seats in Congress, albeit a minority one. The office of the president itself has less overseas war-making powers, but expansive powers to deploy the military and federal agencies for domestic peacekeeping, though non-military agencies like the FIA are distrusted and have little effective power. Many of the decisions are actually made by the regional committees, a structure created by President Seward while he was trying to prevent the country from completely collapsing into anarchy. This structure grouped the states into regions, each of which has internally at least 1 major military base, is self-sufficient in food production, and has roughly similar social views across the region. The Free States are treated as a single region in this arrangement, with an organization called the Free State Board composed of representatives from each Free State coordinating their activities and deciding who takes the Free State Regional Committee seat. Each region has a single representative called a consul on the committee. The Vice President holds the position of Proconsul on this committee. This effectively replaces many of the committees of the old congressional system. All bills submitted by the Senate must go through a process of rewriting, amendment, and approval in the committee before they can be put to a vote for the full Senate. In order to declare war, the President must submit their case to the committee for approval, and only if they deadlock can they appeal to the Senate to vote on it. Consuls of the committee are elected by regional popular vote for a single 4-year term, a practice that has so far isolated the committee from much corporate influence. Regarding political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats are still around and dominate politics, but there are some 300 minor political parties. The 2 largest are the Independent Party, mostly a fixture for those frustrated with the 2 parties that has little impact for change, and the One World Party, which is a corporate-backed pro-free market party. Large parts of the voting public being violently anti-corporate has prevented them from achieving their goals fully so far. In general, national politics isn't something most Americans think of. As for the judicial branch, the resurgence of states' rights has led to the decline of the Supreme Court's once sweeping influence. The use of legal expert and AI-driven systems has also allowed many legal matters to be quickly settled at lower court levels. The reduced caseload of the Supreme Court has led to a reduction in its members to 5 justices rather than 7, each assisted by an AI system. In the executive branch, the most radically changed department is the Department of Defense. Due to the challenges of the collapse and distrust in other agencies dominated by the Gang of Four, the military has a vastly expanded mandate handling peacekeeping and intelligence operations both abroad and domestically, though the former is much reduced from what it used to be. By 2020, the only major military commitments the U.S. has abroad are the occupation of the Panama Canal and Guam, but it also invests heavily in maintaining orbital assets and thus maintaining a foothold in space. Because of the expanded mandate, the Secretary of Defense is thus the number 3 figure in the U.S. government behind the President and Vice President. While once the Secretary of Defense was appointed by each new president, now the post is considered too crucial to be subject to the whims of each new administration. The Secretary of Defense can only be appointed or replaced by a vote of the Regional Committee. The Department of Commerce and the Treasury is responsible for laws and policy around trade and commerce, but spends much of its resource investigating currency fraud. Lack of faith in the American dollar has led to the common use of the eurodollar in the U.S. economy, so the department has found itself investigating eurodollar fraud as well. The Department of Justice is much reduced from its former extent. The military has taken over so many domestic peacekeeping roles that there is constant friction between the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense. The Department of Health, Education, and Human Services exists to administer agencies like the National Institute of Health, but the budget is small and they exist primarily to address the biotech crises of the new century like the wasting plague. However, they've also been accused of spreading toxins and diseases to further the government's control. The proximity of disease outbreaks to other areas of government interest is regarded as highly suspicious by many. The Department of Energy is the only part of the government that actually makes money, as they not only regulate all manner of power generation, but also operate the Energy Management Cooperative, a privatized monopoly similar to the pre-collapse postal system, which is traded on the stock exchange. The Department of Energy has managed some genuine improvements, replacing most coal-fired power plants with hydrogen-fired plants that are cheaper and more environmentally friendly. The Department of Agriculture and the Interior is a complete joke that hasn't been effective since the 1980s. Even if corporate projects usually get denied approval, the corporation usually just bribes as many officials as required and proceeds anyway. They did manage to do some good in the early days of the collapse. In a bid to save at least some protected land from exploitation, the department sold 10 million acres to environmental action groups for pennies. The corporations that wanted the land spent 2 years waging a guerrilla war all over America trying to wrest control of such land, some going bankrupt in the process. By the time the dust settled, corporations control about half the land, the rest being in various trusts and co-ops to keep it legally protected. The land is now usually the transient home of nomad groups that discourage any attempt to take it by force. To return to the Department of Defense for a moment, let's talk about the military. While the military has stepped back from directly controlling the nation, it remains deeply embedded in the government, with regional committee members having military liaisons to ensure military interests are always taken into account. The new organization of the military also reflects the era of military rule over the states. Back then, each military district was assigned a host of disparate units from most branches of the service with the aim of being equipped to handle any sudden crisis that might arise. Though the military districts have gone, their legacy remains in the Combined Operation Groups, or COGs. Resource shortages meant heavier units could not operate effectively at the time, so it was decided the optimum mix was to have one heavy striker unit, one lighter and larger patrol contingent, with an aerial support and recon element. This forms the basis for the COGs, with elements of this arrangement being drawn from different branches of the service as available. A COG will usually be composed of an Army Armored Battalion, an infantry force from the Army or Marine Corps, and an air wing drawn from any of the Army, Marine, or even Navy air units. If you're wondering what the Air Force is doing, they were renamed as the Aerospace Force and are exclusively focused on orbital operations. All traditional air units were folded into the new Army Air Corps. The COG system has plenty of critics, mostly from within the service, but its defenders argue this is the optimal setup with modern communication technology and coordination. Commanders have also worked to squash inter-service rivalries. COG units live and train on the same home base with an emphasis that the COG comes first and the parent unit comes second. COGs are assigned regional areas of military jurisdiction and a home base. They are responsible for patrolling the nation and defending from threats both foreign and domestic. The individual branches of service continue to operate their own units, though the Army in particular tends to be heavily involved in COG unit operations. The Army is still the largest military force in the U.S. with the most armor, and now more flexible with the addition of the Army Air Corps, though the U.S. Marine Corps' Powered Armor Response Unit is broadly considered the nation's elite combat force. As for the Air Force, again, during the period of martial law from 1996 to 1999, military governors effectively absorbed Air Force units into their own contingents, mostly in ground support roles, and during the period of military reorganization that followed, the commanders of the Army and Air Force reached a compromise. The Air Force yielded all terrestrial aircraft operations to the newly formed Army Air Corps, while the Army would help push for reformation of the Air Force into the Aerospace Force, dedicated to orbital operations. If you're interested, this is actually kind of a funny historic reversal, since the U.S. Air Force was originally an auxiliary branch of the Army before becoming a separate branch of the service after World War II. Since its creation, the U.S. Aerospace Force invested in building scramjets, armed shuttles, and military space stations in massive numbers. These forces were decimated during the orbital war with the EEC and the Soviets, not to mention the whole service branch being decapitated when Colorado Springs was destroyed. Ever since then, they've been quietly rebuilding. The European Space Agency and its large habitats may dominate high orbit, but the U.S. Aerospace Force has the largest number of attack craft, battle stations, and EVA troops in low orbit. Lastly, and notably, the U.S. Navy operates the largest submarine service in the world, as it has since the Cold War, only now their nuclear-equipped missiles target Paris, Brussels, and other major cities of the European Economic Community instead of Moscow. This is a deterrent should the EEC ever decide to start dropping rocks from the moon again. Aside from this, however, the Navy is actually much reduced, only operating 2 aircraft carriers. It is still the largest combat navy in the world, since most of the USSR's navy was sold off during its collapse and rebirth as the Neo-Soviet Union. With the withdrawal of most American forces abroad, the Navy is mostly occupied with the defense of U.S. territorial waters as well as operations protecting its hold on Guam and the Panama Canal. On the state level, most states have some sort of state militia or guard that is deployed in emergencies when federal troops aren't available. For the free states, however, this goes a step further. Rather than a national guard, each of the free states has their own state military with substantial hardware, some of it acquired by straight-up nationalizing or defecting military assets from the federal government back when the free states were formed. Any free state by itself definitely wouldn't stand a chance if the government got serious about revoking their status, but together they could definitely make it a painful and costly operation. Lastly, military relations with the corporations. With Operation Big Stick, the military made clear they would not tolerate overt corporate efforts to subvert the American government, but they do maintain cordial relations with many military suppliers such as EBM, Orbital Air, even Arasaka. But by far the biggest provider of weapons and military hardware for the US is Militech. That relationship was built largely by Militech's CEO and former Marine Corps General Donald Lundy, who built the company from a minor military contractor into one of the foremost arms manufacturers and paramilitary forces on the planet over the course of the past 20 years. Alright, now that we've talked about the government and the military, let's talk about what it's actually like to live in the country. As of 2020, the distribution of wealth in the United States stands at 10% well-off, 15% middle class, 10% impoverished, and a whopping 65% living in squalid misery. The hyper-concentration of wealth and growing irrelevance of manual labor has metastasized into what is effectively a two-tier economic system. Remember, the economy was all but completely eviscerated along with most jobs back in the 1990s to start with, and the economy has only somewhat recovered back on a positive trajectory. Approximately 50 million Americans are living as nomads or are otherwise homeless. Another 120 million or so are tax-paying citizens of varying levels of income. Most of the population is crowded into the major cities, since so many smaller towns and communities were abandoned. Also remember that 100 million people died during the collapse, so the US population is much smaller than it was in the real year 2020, just recovering to around 200 million. Those that remained had to deal with the social collapse. As of 2020, only about 2% of Americans enjoy the classic two-parent nuclear family, in part because 1 in 3 of those deaths during the collapse was a parent, and about 11% of the population grew up without any family structure at all. There are few, if any, social programs, including no public schooling system in most states. In fact, most cities only have a single university with grotesquely long waiting lists to get in, and otherwise private education options are prohibitively expensive. As a result, the majority of youths in 2020 are street children that grew up with minimum, if any, supervision thanks to their parents' high workloads. About 90% of street kids will fall in with a youth gang of some kind, some as a junior affiliate of a more serious booster gang, but many others as what are called feral families, acting out a twisted sort of family structure, and more still as part of a local block gang where older members in the neighborhood will hopefully look after them. Those few with parents employed by corporations have luckier circumstances, but even that is a mixed blessing. Those whose parents work at the lower levels of the corporate ladder are often folded into the meta-family of corporate daycare, preschool, and further education programs. These are provided as a benefit of the company, but not out of generosity. Effectively, these programs are about grooming children to be corporate employees. By age 8, children are assigned a cohort of their peers and spend most of their time with them or with teachers, allowing only limited contact with their own parents. By age 12, such corporate children undergo aptitude testing determining where they will start their careers in the corporation. At the middle and upper levels, corporate families are able to indulge classic middle-class child-rearing methods and raise their children at home with the help of as many servants or expensive care options as they can afford. These children tend to be raised with a strong sense of elitism, and their parents tend to engage in a vicarious competition pitting their children against the children of other upper corporate families. The stress levels on the children are enormous at all levels of corporate education, culminating in a final exam at the age of 15. Among those that fail these exams, suicide is not exactly unheard of. The family situation is made worse by the housing situation, as most of the population is crammed into the major cities. Outside of corporate subsidized housing, virtually nobody can afford the rent on a multi-bedroom family apartment without living in a less than pleasant part of town. In fact, just about nobody can afford to own their own home. It's all renting corporate-owned housing for the most part. Many single adults live in apartment cubes barely 2 or 3 meters across. The development of mallplex and arcology projects has compounded the issue of rising population density. Food is also an issue. The U.S. has lost and regained its ability to feed itself over the collapse. Most of the crops are actually used to create biofuel, so most of the food is manufactured. The most common and cheapest of these is a dry grain-like food called kibble, originally created to serve relief efforts in South America, jammed with a full day's worth of vitamins and minerals with some protein as well. The other common option is tailored protein, generically known as single-cell organic protein, or SCOP. These can be made to fill any food niche. There's hamburger SCOP, chicken SCOP, cheese SCOP, broccoli SCOP. Allegedly, it looks indistinguishable from the real thing. The real thing is still available, if you're a millionaire. For everyone else, real food is a treat you might get to enjoy once or twice in a year. As to what people in society believe, religion and various philosophies are in a constant state of flux. The Roman Catholic Church has enjoyed a surge in popularity following reforms in 2014 allowing for priests to marry and promoting a more modern view of birth control. The institution of the Church provides a much-needed sense of stability and safe haven in these trying times. They've also embraced a philosophy of looking after their own. The Church has been known to deploy Swiss soldiers to protect Church-owned land against corporate threats, and also provide sanctuary for church members being hunted by corporate agents. Amongst other Christian groups, fundamentalist strains of Christianity have enjoyed a resurgence in the South, while the Mormons actually survived the collapse quite well, being a powerful bloc in the West. Islam has also gained in popularity, as well as strains of Buddhism arriving with new immigrants, courtesy of the U.S.'s strengthening ties with Japan and China. Judaism has not fared well in the States, with American Jews feeling cut off from much of the world, and not to mention the severing of U.S. relations with Israel as the U.S. retreated from the world stage. What synagogues still exist tend to have very loyal followings as Jewish communities seek to protect themselves from the general chaos. Various fringe religions and cults, both new and old, also exist. There are also various philosophies that have gained popularity. Forms of neo-Luddism have popped up, those that pursue violence and rejection of high technology, seeking a return to a more personal society that isn't littered with the victims of cyberpsychosis, the chaos of industrial waste, or the quagmire of bioproducts. Individual groups differ in their tactics, and some, like the Inquisitors, are widely hated for their violence against cyborgs, but all agree that a new paradigm is needed. Then there are various strains of nihilism, this describing a group that has given up on mankind completely. They hold that mankind has lost control of its destiny and is enslaved to the machine it's created, and thus many choose not to remain a part of this corrupt society, believing death to be the only true form of expression remaining. Thus, nihilists taking their lives in acts of artistic terrorism is not unusual. Then there's techno-humanism, a new movement that's attained rising popularity among young people and especially the online subculture. The general thrust of the idea is that since mankind is now in control of its own evolution, what we will become in the future is beyond our current comprehension. Members of the movement believe mankind will fuse with technology and ultimately be reborn on the other side into a sort of nirvana when we have fully transformed. When it comes to philosophies of a more specifically political bent, the 90s and early 2000s saw the rise of the rocker movement. From the 90s until the end of military rule in 2008, freedom of speech, let alone effective rule of law, didn't really exist, and overtly political artists often had short careers and short lives for pissing off the wrong people. This only inspired an angrier and more fiercely critical movement of artists and fans, some of whom would use their work to inspire riots and protests. To be a rocker boy was to be willing to risk your life to make a point, whatever that may be. One of the bands to emerge of this was, of course, Samurai, a rock band fronted by a military deserter going by Johnny Silverhand. The band itself only lasted a few years before breaking up in 2008, but both Johnny and his bandmate Carrie Eurodyne went on to have successful solo careers. It was safer to be a rocker after the end of military rule. They also just got better at staying alive. Not everyone finds their outlet through protest. Sports are still popular, though they have changed. American professional sports basically stopped for 10 years during the collapse, during which most of the old stadiums fell into disrepair or were repurposed. That damage wasn't contained to the States. The Olympics haven't been held since 1992. Nonetheless, American football and soccer have made a return as highly popular sports, but not unchanged. Both sports feature heavily augmented players. In soccer, cybernetics became so ubiquitous within a few years the ball had to be redesigned to withstand 500 psi impacts. American football is by far the most violent and deadliest sanctioned sport. All augmentations short of full-body replacement and linear frames are allowed. Full-body armored plating is common, often covered in spikes, and they are not decorative. Fatalities are common and considered good for ratings. Other sports still exist, though in a scattered and less popular form than they used to. Baseball is almost entirely unaugmented, at least. All the things I've just described mostly apply to the cities where most of the population is concentrated. Outside of that, things are a bit different. Remember, many of the smaller cities and towns were abandoned during the collapse, and with the lack of law enforcement during those years, many of those roads are filled with go gangs, roving bands of effectively biker gangs that pillage the abandoned towns, and some of whom will prey upon any travelers, though they don't exclusively use bikes. Traveling cross-country is riskier than ever before. This might go some way to explain why dirigibles have apparently made a comeback as a transportation method. It lets cargo and passengers avoid the risk of the open road while being cheaper than planes considering how costly fuel has become. This is not to say it's impossible to travel without being attacked, it just involves risk, and the safest thing to do is to contract with a corporation for protection. There are other ways. There is an underground maglev line that crosses the country from Night City in the west to Washington, D.C. in the east, plus whatever remains of the traditional rail network. Many airship routes are also open, connecting many of the remaining major cities. Of course, there's always the option of contacting a nomad group and seeing if you can strike a deal to join a caravan to get where you want to go. There's a lot to be said about the nomads, and I think it's probably worth a video on its own someday, so I won't go too deep here, but I will try to give you all the major points. Of the approximately 50 million people described as nomads or otherwise homeless, roughly 7 million belong to a proper organized nomad nation. The nation is the largest level of nomad organization, composed of up to 1 million people. The nomads don't have a single origin story. They came out of various regions of the country and adopted the life for any number of reasons. The shape of their stories tends to be pretty similar, though. The collapse destroyed a lot of towns and a lot of lives, and the soul-crushing conditions of many urban areas left many adrift. These people took to the road looking for something better than what the collapse had given them, and were either unable or unwilling to resettle in overcrowded urban zones. They developed a culture of mobility, a new type of motorized civilization that can move hundreds of miles in a single day. The hardships of the road built a strong sense of community and unity. While stereotyped as rapacious raiders and bandits, nomads often provide valuable skills and labor to the settlements they encamp near, especially in all the rebuilding there was to do after the collapse and the future catastrophes of the corporate wars. They actually tend to have libraries that make them more well-read than most city dwellers. They're also talented at scavenging many of the abandoned towns and cities for resources. Their mobility and tendency to be well-armed also puts them in demand to transport cargo and messages too sensitive to risk digital transmission over long distances. Thus, nomads form an important part of America's shadow economy and black markets. At the base level, the smallest unit of the nomad social structure is a family, composed of anywhere from 10 to 100 individuals. These form the basis for nomad society, as entire neighborhoods were set adrift during the collapse. As more nomads banded together, you would get clans composed of between 300 and 1,200 people. Eventually, as clans started working together, you would get tribes of between 10,000 and 30,000 people. The tribes formed the basis for the nomad economy, as these great masses of people would be hired for construction work on city reconstruction efforts in the post-collapse world, as well as seasonal harvesting work, among other jobs requiring the vast amount of labor and vehicles nomads can provide. When enough tribes form alliances based on common cause and work, that's when a nation is formed, being composed of anywhere from 100,000 to 1,000,000 people. There are 7 recognized Nomad Nations in the cyberpunk world of 2020, each with very different characters, but through a series of conferences and treaties formalized in 2017, all have agreed to abide by some common codes and practices, most notably the Nomad Code. Protect and respect your clan, and above all, your family. Your word is your bond. Share with your clanfolk. Respect the privacy and property of your clan. Never cause trouble for your clan, and take only a fair wage for a day's work. Simple and straightforward rules for what is usually a simple and straightforward way of life. While nomads are often conflated with bloodthirsty raiders and untrustworthy vagabonds, they generally believe in fair dealing and earning what they need. Thus, they need to navigate a country that simultaneously fears them and needs the labor they can provide. Nomads look at a map of the states very differently from the urban dwellers, whom they call statics. They know which regions have seasonal work, where major developments and infrastructure work is going on, where the best places for nomad gathering and wintering are, and very importantly, which areas are dangerous no-go zones for nomads. Now, let's discuss the Nomad Nations. The creation of the first true nomad group is often attributed to one Juan Aldecaldo. He was a childhood immigrant that grew up in California and became a first-generation college graduate, going on to work in the defense industry and raise a family in Los Angeles. He lost his job shortly before the collapse, and tragedy would follow from there. His daughter would lose her life in a car accident before her 17th birthday. His son took it hard and dropped out of school, eventually joining a street gang. He also lost his wife to cancer. Then his son was killed during a robbery. When Juan arrived at the scene, a reporter rushed to get his reaction. His response would go viral. Juan exploded into an enraged rant, demanding to see the surveillance tapes for himself. He called the media vultures that make their living off the poor victims of this country. He said his son was a better man than them. He cursed the police for lying to him and saying they would do all they could to find his son's killers when they really just saw him as another dead ganger the city was better off without. He said the police and the politicians didn't care about the people, only their own power as long as their families were safe. He called the president a traitor. worthless to the working people of this country. Aldecaldo's words struck a chord with many. 7,000 people showed up to his son's funeral, all united by common loss to the gangs and the violence. Juan only sat and watched his son's burial, but his friend and parish priest Jonah Dominguez delivered a moving speech to the crowd. Juan Aldecaldos had lost all will to live, but Jonah drew him to start helping out at his small mission, helping orphans and other lost souls. One day, the mission house was hit by a drive-by shooting, wounding both men. They had enough. Juan and Jonah armed themselves and gathered up some of the parishioners, watching for the gangers from the rooftops and taking them out. Eventually, the gangers got wise and started attacking them directly, but this just brought out more members of the neighborhood to help as Juan and Jonah's groups reclaimed block after block. Eventually, they controlled a small subdivision in East Los Angeles. This was a huge embarrassment to the police and the city government. After much hassling from officials and increasing gang attacks, Juan and Jonah realized that LA wasn't going to get any better. One night they simply left, and 5,000 people followed them. Thus began the Aldecaldos family. Jonah would die of a heart attack in 2002, and Juan would struggle alone to lead the Aldecaldos. Eventually, he would lead them south across the border to work on the Mexico City reconstruction project. The Mexican economy had been heavily tied to the American economy when the stock crash hit and suffered total economic devastation, leading to widespread disruption. They spent years there, and when American veterans started making their way north during the long walk, the Aldecaldos provided aid, and some even joined up. They returned to the States in 2015, bearing the body of Juan Aldecaldo, who had recently passed to be buried with his family in LA. They had a new leader who had taken Juan's name in solidarity, Santiago Aldecaldo. They would also have one Johnny Silverhand among them. The rocker had been in hiding with the Aldecaldos since instigating a riot against and attacking the Arasaka office in Night City in 2013. Under Santiago's charismatic leadership, the Aldecaldos would become the second largest and arguably the most powerful Nomad nation by 2020. If there's anyone with a strong challenge to the Aldecaldos being the first nomads, it's the Jodes. Their origins can be traced to a mass of people, many farmers, that were driven from their homes in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas due to ecological destruction thanks to droughts during the collapse. These people gradually migrated to Colorado, hoping to rest and gather food before crossing the Rocky Mountains. The locals, however, were far from pleased by their presence. One night, a few hundred locals mounted a raid to scatter the refugees, which degenerated into a series of disjointed firefights across the Colorado countryside. Eventually, the raiders withdrew, having killed some 400 of the travelers. Those that remained were enraged. A man named Malachi, said to be a man of God, came up with the idea for each family among the refugees to send a representative for a council to decide what to do. He chaired the meeting and spoke about what awaited them over the Rockies, potential employment on government projects, and that they might be best off working together. The families soon came to an agreement for the future. They all wanted safety for their families, revenge on their attackers, and the right to leave this compact anytime they saw fit. Taking inspiration from the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, and other famous documents of America's past, the group decided to sign a compact that would form the basis for the later Nomad Code. It would be much more concise than those old documents, with the wording usually attributed to Malachi, though he denies it. Protect your family first, then protect the clan. Steal nothing from the others in the clan. Hoard nothing that could benefit others in the clan. For all this, Malachi is sometimes called the first nomad. Over his objections, the other families demanded revenge for the attack. The plan was not to slaughter the town, but to steal from them and leave them destitute through the winter. When the nomads approached the town by night, however, the situation rapidly spun out of control as the desire for revenge drove many of them on, and the locals fought back. By the time the sun rose, the town's stores and farms were ransacked, and the nomads had killed or kidnapped about a third of the town's population. Malachi and many others were furious over this result, in part because they feared whatever remained of the law would be after them now. The only thing they could think to do was run. When they came down over the Rockies, they sought work in the rebuilding of Los Angeles, which had recently been struck by the big quake of '98. They actually worked alongside the Aldecaldos on that project. It was the news media that first started calling them the Jodes, and members of the clan would adopt it. Malachi would be the first, signing the Los Angeles contract with the name Jode. The Jodes are unusually open to allowing outsiders to join their group, a quality that made other nomads suspicious of them and fear they would just become another gang. These fears proved unfounded. However, they are also the nomads that most consciously reject any kind of return to a static way of life. They even refuse to set up camp anywhere in the city limits of where they work. This might be some remaining fear of being held to account for what happened in Colorado, or perhaps they simply see the open road as true freedom. I'll be upfront about this. The Blood Nation has a very weird backstory involving a real-life gang, the Disney Corporation, and Barnum and Bailey Circus. The history of the Blood Nation starts with a chapter of the Bloods, a real-life criminal gang with chapters in various cities across the country, which was probably at the height of its media prominence in the 80s and 90s. This chapter was located in Miami at the start of the collapse. Florida had a rough go of it during the collapse. Not only were they plagued by the same economic collapse and social disorder as the rest of the nation, they also had to deal with hurricanes without any benefit of government relief efforts. In Miami in particular, the collapse of the drug trade after the DEA destroyed South American drug crops created a power vacuum in the city's criminal landscape formerly dominated by cartel affiliates. Vicious turf wars broke out. The state and municipal governments were stretched so thin by everything else going on that they eventually just cordoned off the city and let the gangsters kill each other. When the dust settled in 1996, the Bloods had emerged as the top dogs. The gang itself had changed a lot in that time, though. The gang had absorbed many Haitian, Cuban, and other Caribbean immigrants, along with their culture. In particular, many believers in Vodun and Santeria joined up, both being syncretic Afro-Caribbean religions combining aspects of traditional African faiths, Christianity, and other spiritualistic beliefs. Priestesses started advising the gang's leaders, and eventually the gang took on a matriarchal quality with the priestesses running the show. By this time, Miami was a wreck. A sizable proportion of the buildings were in ruins, and the streets were filled with shot-up cars. The new leaders of the Bloods decided to leave the city for greener pastures. The pasture in question was the derelict Walt Disney World, having been closed by the Disney Corporation during the collapse. Disney had also purchased P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus during the collapse and parked their resources and performers in Disney World before closing it down. So when the Bloods arrived, they found a mix of circus performers, Disney staff, and cast members still living in the housing of the park. You might not expect the hardened gangers to mesh well with the entertainers, but surprisingly they did. In fact, they encouraged them to stay, and the entertainers taught them their craft. Together, they ultimately formed the greatest traveling entertainment group of the new millennium, launching their first national tour in the year 2000. I'm not kidding, this really is their backstory. They had thousands of members in these traveling caravans, entertaining nomads and statics alike. Eventually, as civilian control of the nation was reasserted, the Disney Corporation decided they wanted their park back. They hired Lazarus, the most elite mercenary force on the planet, to evict the squatters. Once they saw Lazarus approaching, the Bloods quickly agreed to leave without a fight. Thus, they became true nomads. While they are known as entertainers, the Bloods take on the same sort of work contracts as the rest of the nomads. In fact, one of the first things they did after leaving Disney World was return to Miami to work on a major complex there. Due to their popularity as entertainers, the Blood Nation faces a bit less resistance wherever they go, being the only nomad clan to ever be allowed into Canada, for one thing. As I said, it's a weird story. The folk nation traces its origin to Black Chicago street gangs, though it evolved to accept any ethnic background as long as they adopt the inner-city black subculture that the nation carries with it. They existed even before the collapse. The folk were very much a powerful gang, expanding its chapters to become the dominant gang across the Midwest with over 50,000 members. During the collapse, the focus of the gang shifted to just trying to survive martial law and even helping others survive, operating a black market and transportation network across the region and pulling its members out of the worst affected areas. The gang's rebirth as nomads came after the Chicago bioplague incident of 2012. The gang's headquarters and entire upper leadership was trapped in the city by the Army's quarantine, effectively decapitating the folk in one stroke. A local leader of the gang out of Kansas City, going by Mr. Cool, rallied the other remaining leaders to find a new way to survive. In his mind, remaining in one place would leave them vulnerable to a similar catastrophe. He'd specialized in transportation and smuggling, so that's where they started, but they also reached out to nomad groups looking for contract work across the Midwest. Thus, a new nomad tribe was born, with a focus on transportation. The folk nation also has a sizable nautical component, operating transport lines across the Great Lakes. The folk nation is very grateful for the help they received from the nomad community as a whole, and is thus quite open to accepting other nomads joining them. They took in a lot of nomad refugees coming home from the long walk. They've never lost their attachment to Chicago, making them one of the only nomad groups that seems to actively want to return to a static existence. The folk nation actively supports any effort made to rebuild the city. An oddity even among nomads, Metacorp, also called the Meta Corporation or simply Meta, is a nomad nation that is also a corporation. The story is a bit long, but it starts with a man named Jonathan Meta. He was in the US military, a career officer, supposedly in special forces and deployed to South America during the 2000s. All was well and good for him until the civilians retook control of the American government in 2008. Somehow, all records of Jonathan Meta disappeared in the confusion of the handover. He wouldn't find this out until 2011 when the US pulled out of South America and he found himself denied transportation back to the States. Since he was the commander of a unit that did not officially exist in the first place, there was very little he could do to straighten this out. Like the many nomad contractors, Jonathan Meta found himself faced with the long walk home. He did not take this well. Meta stormed out of the American command in San Jose, Costa Rica, and with several hundred like-minded soldiers, hijacked 3 transport craft and made for Panama. There, they met up with several thousand abandoned contractors that Meta rallied behind him, driving them to seize everything that could float, including the remains of a damaged carrier group and 3 offshore oil platforms. They holed up off the Panamanian coast and declared themselves a sovereign nation, claiming to have nuclear weapons that they would use if interfered with. Jonathan Meta sounds like an absolute madman right about now, but this was all a little more calculated than it seemed. The US government had too much going on to want to call Meta's bluff. For the newly formed board of the Metacorp, they were all military men that had become thoroughly disillusioned with their country's government and felt betrayed by their superiors in military command. They didn't want to re-engage with the American government or society except as equals with leverage. Taking advantage of the billions of dollars of hardware they'd stolen, they established Metacorp as a security and maritime construction company. They reaped massive profits over the next few years working on construction projects in the States, allowing them to begin construction of Meta Key, a mobile artificial island that serves as the group's home base and operates under no law but their own. Construction completed on it in 2020, with the Key being mostly stationed in the Gulf of Mexico. Metacorp also got involved with arms development, most notably developing America's first ACPA, Assisted Combat Personnel Armor, in 2017. They sold the patents to Militech, which went a long way to getting the American military off their backs. These lightweight jacksuit ACPA models are apparently used by the police forces on Meta Key. You might think this sounds more like a small nation than a nomad group, but Metacorp has always maintained strong connections with other nomads, remembering those abandoned during the long walk. Particularly during a troubled period during the 2010s, Metacorp arranged supply airdrops and support for other nomads suffering from bandit attacks that the government refused to acknowledge. Metacorp also made a point to subcontract its jobs out to other nomad groups whenever possible, including bringing them in as outside workers on Meta Key. In total, they've funneled billions of dollars into the nomad economy. These actions bought them acceptance within the nomad community at large. A nomad nation you don't hear talked about very much is the SoU Nation. These are chiefly waterborne nomads operating in various parts of the coast. Unlike most of the groups I've mentioned so far, they don't really have much of a common origin story. While many took to the road in search of better circumstances, others took to the waterways, mostly on the southern seaboard and the Caribbean coast. The government officially classifies most of them as pirates because many of them refuse to register their vessels with any home port or nation, though only some of them actually engage in piracy. The Coast Guard lacks anywhere approaching the necessary resources to effectively police most waterways, so the SoU Nation isn't too worried about it. They've become quite widespread, being found in all coastal areas of the continental states as well as the Great Lakes, and all along the Mississippi, Missouri, St. Lawrence, and Columbia rivers. For the most part, they engage in a variety of activities from marine farming, smuggling, legitimate cargo hauling, refugee transport, a small amount of piracy, and broadcasting. That last is quite lucrative, as being able to transmit off the coast outside the reach of local governments is a quite sought-after capability for those wanting to spread information without censorship. In the Gulf of Mexico, many have taken over abandoned oil rigs and similar structures, forming a community with smaller groups all across the Caribbean. In some of these makeshift settlements, the common language is a patois of English, French, Vietnamese, and Spanish, though most speak English to some degree. There is a nominal leadership position among the SoU, but realistically they can only control their immediate clan. They are very decentralized. Lastly, there's the youngest and largest of the 7 nations, the Snake Nation. The Snake Nation was formed in direct response to the formation of the other 6 nations. There are nigh countless small nomad bands across the United States that have nothing to do with the other 6 nomad nations, and many of them viewed the ascent and growing influence of those nations with apprehension. Many of these groups came together with the goal of maintaining their autonomy while having a voice in greater nomad politics. With this mindset, they adopted a symbol and motto inspired by American Revolutionary history, a white section snake on a red field over the words, "Don't tread on me." Being rather libertarian-minded, Snake Nation bands typically prefer to be left to their own devices, and thus the nation isn't very organized, but they have a presence in every corner of the nomad economy, and have a policy of trying to improve their marketable skills to better compete with other nomads for jobs. That's all the nomad nations, but there is one more group we need to discuss, the Rafin Shiv. They are the outcasts of nomad society, scavengers and sociopaths that prey on the weak. These are the Mad Max stereotypes much of society thinks of when they consider the nomads. Most of them were expelled from their old nomad groups for any number of crimes, generally something that harmed other members of the group, especially maliciously. Nomads don't exactly operate jails and shy away from summary execution, so many of their worst criminals end up set loose away from the clan. As a result, Rafin Shiv gangs prowl the highways and sometimes waterways looking for targets of opportunity. Normal nomads do not consider them a part of nomad society, and in fact despise them as utterly subhuman monsters, and given their common behavior, it isn't hard to see why. Calling a nomad Rafin Shiv is a good way to get punched or shot. Alright, now we'll close off the 2020 discussion with a closer look at regions of the country and how things have changed at a more fine-grained level. These are the same regions used to govern the nation and organize representation in the legislature, so these are political rather than purely geographic groupings. Those are the regional committees I mentioned back in the government section. We'll start in my neck of the woods, the Northeast. It was absolutely wrecked by the collapse along with most of the eastern seaboard. Of course, you should remember that nuclear bomb that went off in New York City in '93, but that was only part of it. When the collapse truly took hold, the eastern seaboard was a battle zone filled with street violence, drugs, municipal bankruptcy, and racial tension. People migrated out of the region in droves once the jobs dried up, and with them their only reason to stay. Massive archaeology megaprojects that had started when the collapse hit were stopped incomplete and slowly decayed to this day. By 2020, the region is plagued by acid rain, rampant corruption, and large-scale pollution. Moving from north to south, we'll start by taking a look at Maine. Maine has actually avoided most of the ecological damage, having much less industrial development than many states and carefully maintaining its fisheries. Actually, bands of independent privateers have been going out with armed vessels to attack foreign fishing vessels casting their nets in those waters. There's work for skilled operators on such outings. Internally, Maine heavily polices its borders and patrols for those visiting the state without a visitation permit or a valid ID number. They really want to prevent any spillover of the social degeneration from the more urbanized states as much as possible, and they aren't alone in that. Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire are all part of a group called the Seaboard Cooperative. Ironically, only one of those states is a coastline, but they all coordinate for mutual support, even maintaining a large joint police force that rigorously discourages nomads from entering the region. These states all have a similar aversion to the societal decay of the states just to their south, with a sizable proportion of their population favoring a regional repartitioning, and some even secession to Canada. They maintain strong relations with the Canadian provinces just to the north: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island. It's suggested that whether Canada or the states collapses first, these provinces and the cooperative will throw their lot in together. As I said, New Hampshire is also part of the Seaboard Cooperative and a similar rural state to Maine. To New Hampshire falls most of the work in managing the collective's primary border crossing with Massachusetts, which they do zealously. Almost every road crossing the state has with Massachusetts was physically torn up and destroyed, with the only exceptions of U.S. Highway 3 and Interstate 95, which remain to facilitate trade with the rest of the nation. Even then, these highways are flanked by concrete bunkers and heavily monitored. They also don't allow non-cooperative truckers to carry cargo in the Seaboard Cooperative. They must transfer their cargo to cooperative truckers at the border and vice versa under the watch of those bunkers. Vermont next door is the similarly situated third and final member of the Seaboard Cooperative, having torn up roads leading into New York and Massachusetts, including large stretches of Interstate 91. They've allowed Interstate 91 and 89 to remain open on the northern border leading into Canada, a border they manage in much the same way New Hampshire manages their border with Massachusetts. Vermont gets hit by acid rain coming over the border from New York, but has largely managed to protect its environment from pollution. I'll tell you, as someone that's lived my whole life in the Northeast, the idea of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine tearing up the roads to keep the mass holes out is eminently believable. 10 out of 10 world building. Now I want to talk about New York before I talk about any of the states around New York City, because they were all deeply affected by what happened after the nuclear attack in 1993. The nuclear blast destroyed Rockefeller Center, flattened Carnegie Hall, and even gutted the UN headquarters. It also occurred during a series of ongoing riots and ethnic violence incidents, all of which blew out into an orgy of looting and unrest in the days following the bombing. Faced with the destruction within their own neighborhoods, many first responder personnel called in sick. The situation escalated as the looters were emboldened until the entire city was a free-for-all in the first week. The chaos spread through all the boroughs and even to Long Island. Fearing spillover, the New Jersey National Guard barricaded all bridges between the state and New York City, threatening to shoot anyone that tried to cross without a white flag. They even moved into New York State and secured the Tappan Zee Bridge in the north, forcing those fleeing the city to travel 20 miles upstate before crossing the Hudson River. Within a week, the city government had effectively lost control and ceased to exist. After delegates from the city failed to appear at the state legislature in Albany, the state government designated New York City, the entirety of Long Island, Staten Island, Bronx County, and parts of Westchester to be a probationary territory, to return to political power when it demonstrated self-governance. They even tried to rename the city to distance it from association with the rest of the state, though it never caught on. Everyone that could abandoned the city, anyone with any money especially. The population dwindled as those that remained eked out an existence in a citywide combat zone, subsisting on the remaining canned food stores for several years and tossing the bodies of the dead into the bay. Tempers cooled over time, and many of the residents tried to resume some type of normalcy. But by that time, New York City had been stricken from the map of trade and infrastructure. The ports were empty. Nobody shipped supplies to the city. Nobody supplied water or electricity. Eventually, they managed to get some supplies in, and something of a local economy managed to spring up, but New York City very much looks like it's been through a war. Large sections of the city are in ruins and mostly uninhabited, notably Manhattan Island. There is no government and no utilities. Once the largest and greatest of American cities, according to its own residents, now reduced to a pale husk of itself. Yeah, many of you probably assumed Night City was the worst off of American cities given the way it's often portrayed, but New York City is really the absolute bottom of how things went during the collapse. Upstate New York is a bit of a different story. Civilization hasn't collapsed, but there's no shortage of problems. Acid rain coming in from the west have destroyed much of the natural beauty of its national parks. Arcology projects in Buffalo, Syracuse, and near Albany lie unfinished and decaying since the time of the collapse. Many rural residents of the northern part of the state are highly sympathetic to their neighbors in the Seaboard Cooperative, and would favor a redrawing of borders to group them with Vermont and New Hampshire, or at least similar policies isolating them from the chaos to the south. The state of Connecticut received some of the worst fallout from New York City, in more ways than one. The state government was slow to act and utterly unprepared to absorb or provide for the flow of refugees. The breakdown of the economy and infrastructure led to large-scale deforestation, as both refugees and local residents took to the woods with axes so their families might survive harsh winters. The affluent abandoned the state entirely, and some industries pulled out as well. The further depression of the local economy and ineffective local leadership led to skyrocketing crime rates. After many years of corruption and deficit spending, the state government finally collapsed in 2005. Roads, communication, and other infrastructure rapidly degraded from there. The city governments largely reorganized themselves as cooperatives, absent leadership from the state. The city of New Haven, under the influence of left-wing Yale students, reorganized as a collective that quickly took on the authoritarian straits of Stalinism as time went on. Just outside New Haven is yet another unfinished arcology project, once popular with squatters and the homeless before large sections of it collapsed. It now attracts treasure hunters due to rumors that the dead billionaire that financed the project hid a vast stash of gold there just before the collapse. Lacking a functioning state government, Connecticut has no real say in regional politics, and the city governments are endlessly squabbling with one another. The only maintained parts of the state are a few naval bases, points of order in a desolate coastline awash with biohazardous waste. As mentioned before, the state of New Jersey blockaded the bridges and did everything possible to stem the flow of refugees from New York into the state. One might expect the state to weather the collapse better than Connecticut, but there are plenty of other problems. For starters, even before the collapse, the state had been in a fight with New York, with both trying to attract New York City workers that would pay taxes and spend money in the state where they lived. Before the bombing, New Jersey's great plan in this conflict involved giving large tracts of land in Jersey City, Linden, Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, Fort Lee, and Union City to land developers for a series of highly ambitious arcology projects. These would be model living communities, safe, clean, and with free public transport to the New York state line. Most buildings in the designated areas were razed save those with historic tourism value, and construction commenced. Then the bomb hit New York City and the collapse followed. Construction slowed and the development groups fell to pieces as individual investors tried to get their money out of the projects. Within a few years, most of the venture capitalists involved and the New Jersey state government were bankrupt. Criminal elements from New York and Philadelphia moved in to take advantage of the lack of police, causing large sections of northern New Jersey and especially Jersey City to devolve into human cesspools of crime and addicts. The abandoned arcology projects in particular were prone to this, as they were throughout the region. Like Connecticut, New Jersey's lack of functioning state government means it has little say in regional politics, though some of the local crime lords have influence in New York City and Pennsylvania. Moving back to New England, the state of Massachusetts' biggest problems mostly center around the chaotic growth and corruption of the Boston Metroplex, which is less a single city so much as a collection of separately incorporated subdivisions that have gradually expanded to cover more and more of the state, lacking any kind of unified urban government. Many refugees, and most notably most of the organized criminal groups that fled New York City, also found their way to Boston, and quickly worked their way into the politics and underworld of the state. As a result, the state politics mostly amount to various criminally backed political machines behind each Boston ward vying for influence. These same political machines also staff the police departments, leading to rampant corruption that has become infamous. Thus, citizens of Massachusetts are often too cynical and disillusioned to vote, which of course only encourages these political machines to continue doing the same. The federal military government was able to maintain some order, but since the turnover back to civilian control, the state's government has been spiraling into instability. The western half of the state isn't as badly impacted by acid rain as New York, but Cape Cod was contaminated by a toxic spill that has entirely ruined the once popular vacation spot. Just to the south, the smallest state in the Union has actually weathered the collapse fairly well, largely because Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey absorbed most of the crime and refugees from New York City, while Rhode Island invested heavily in building up its shipping infrastructure and absorbing much of the shipping interests that had once belonged to New York. It's also well isolated from most of the ecological devastation afflicting other states in the region. One political oddity, the capital city of Providence pulled a bit of a coup. Exploiting a technicality, the state representatives from the city declared a quorum when only they were present at the state legislature and expanded the legal borders of Providence to encompass the entire state, reducing other cities to wards of Providence. Thus, Rhode Island is now technically a city-state, effectively governed by the representatives from Providence. Nobody outside the state particularly cares about this development, but given the state's newfound wealth as a regionally critical port, these politicians actually wield a lot of power over the region. Personally, I don't usually think of any state further south or west than New Jersey as part of the Northeast, but that's probably just because I'm from New York. Cyberpunk says Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware are part of this political region, so let's go with it. Let's look at Pennsylvania, apparently the most politically powerful state in the entire region. It hasn't suffered the corruption and political instability of many other states, nor has it lost a major city like New York. It does suffer from significant acid rain fronts rolling through it from the Midwest, and the emissions of the state's own industries add to the problem. The biggest event in the state's recent history, however, was the Pitt Arco nuclear disaster. The state had followed New Jersey's lead in investing in large contained arcology developments. Pittsburgh had a highly ambitious design, a whole environment designed to shelter its residents from the acid rain in luxurious and self-sufficient comfort. It even had its own nuclear reactor, which was where the problem emerged. During testing, an accident occurred that killed all of the reactor staff and some construction workers, flooding the surrounding area with radiation and even poisoning the water table. Many residents of Pittsburgh had to be evacuated, and cancer deaths soared over the next 10 years. Many Pittsburgh industries pulled out of the city, tearing down their factories to rebuild them in the nearby towns of Washington and Beaverville, which have haphazardly evolved into sprawling, underdeveloped new cities as a result. Since the new industrial areas in these cities were often built outside the original town limits, effectively they've become large corporation-controlled enclaves. They also don't pay many taxes to the town governments as a result, leading to significant budget shortfalls and major infrastructure decay. The Aldecaldo's Nomad family was eventually hired for the reclamation project. Finally, looking to Delaware and Maryland. Maryland was the site of quite a lot of civic unrest during the collapse, as many of the federal government's workers in Washington, D.C. had their homes in Maryland. Plenty of citizens looking to violently express their grievances to their congressmen came to Maryland. Thus, many residents actually fled to the protection of military control in D.C. during the collapse, but the state government anticipated they would come back once people got tired of military rule. They incorporated the abandoned suburbs and ghost cities of Bethesda, Rockville, Silver Springs, and Wheaton into the new city of New Green Spring. The state government rebuilt the major roads and offered prospective new residents and developers tax breaks, land grants, and other incentives to drive a massive gentrification scheme. The result was one of the largest land grabs in American history, with a large proportion of the DC population moving en masse to New Greenspring. As a result, the residents of Maryland wield outsized influence in national politics. The new city has grown enough to start developing connections with Baltimore as a growing metroplex. The state government largely ignores and does not invest in the rest of the state. In the western side of the state, the only notable remaining community is a relatively small one at Cumberland. It's completely independent and ignored, receiving no aid from the state and paying no taxes in turn. As for Delaware, the state still bears the scars of the orbital war. At the climax of the conflict, one of the rocks dropped by the ESA hit Delaware Bay directly east of Washington, D.C. The resulting tidal waves slammed into the Delaware coast and flattened a large proportion of the state. Much of the topsoil was washed away or laden with salt. You'll still find pools of salt water in odd places. The state capital, Dover, was heavily damaged and had to be rebuilt. That process brought a lot of investment in, but also a lot of crime that the meager remaining police force has been unable to effectively combat. Thus, the outer ring of suburbs was effectively abandoned. The next region is Appalachia, which has apparently become one of the most politically influential regions of the country. Having been relatively underdeveloped outside the Atlantic coast for much of the past century, the region was spared much of the ecological devastation of the area. Relative stability, low land prices, and a great supply of labor and raw materials brought with it a great deal of investment as the country began to recover from the collapse. The company TerraTech invested heavily in mining in the region, and then repurposed its mine shafts as a subterranean superhighway network that allows much quicker regional transit than the winding roads on the surface. Old towns expanded and new ones sprung up to house the flood of corporate employees moving to the area as Appalachia experienced an unprecedented renaissance. The de facto regional leader is Virginia, which weathered the collapse rather well. The government in Richmond invested heavily in creating new jobs to keep people employed throughout the state, largely by encouraging industrial growth and most notably in a massive expansion of the Norfolk port. Norfolk, in turn, is connected to the rest of the state and Appalachia at large by the new underground superhighways. The Richmond-Petersburg Metroplex is the major metropolitan area of the East Coast these days, aspiring to the questionable heights of the Los Angeles Metroplex on the West Coast. It features a massive showpiece plaza containing all the bureaucratic facilities for running the entire Appalachia region. The national capital of D.C. is essentially a massive military base, so the civilians that didn't want to live there or move to Maryland mostly resettled in Arlington and Alexandria. Officially, D.C. was actually annexed as part of the Appalachia region, but it's controlled by a military governor. Diplomatically speaking, Virginia and West Virginia apparently have a good cop, bad cop routine going. While senators from Virginia play hardball in securing advantages for the Appalachia region, the West Virginia senators encourage amity and good relationships with other states as a means of seeking advantage. West Virginia avoided attracting any refugees or nomad types during the collapse, mostly by actively encouraging the idea that it wasn't a good place to be, including by providing free transit for refugees from one end of the state to the other without a chance to stop. Since the collapse, they've started investing in mining and tunneling operations throughout the mountains to create a superhighway connection to Virginia. The state has become a major transit route for shipments going to the Midwest. Smaller trucking companies and independent truckers have trouble affording the tolls for these superhighway tunnels, however, forcing them to risk a more hazardous route through the mountains to stay competitive. The impoverished communities that live in those areas have made a habit of taking out their frustrations by attacking and robbing such shipments, rendering it a dangerous gauntlet to run. North Carolina was harder hit than the Virginias during the collapse. Rising sea levels led to coastal swamplands becoming inundated and many more acres turning into muddy quagmires. Mosquitoes and other insects multiplied and spread a variety of diseases. Between diseases and general evacuations of the coastal areas, many towns and cities were effectively wiped out. The state soon had no operational ports, though rumor has it there are local pirate groups operating on the coast. The state government rebuilt the economy by welcoming in international agricultural corporations, which swiftly bought up vast swaths of land and heavily subsidized tobacco prices. For a decade, low pay and nicotine addiction was the hallmark of the North Carolina economy, until the rise of synthesized tobacco and cheap designer drugs broke the corporation's hold on the market. New corporations moved in and the economy diversified. The agricultural corporations had to raise pay to keep their workers and offer to fund civic improvements for the state to stay in business. The result has been a net positive for the state. North Carolina also has the distinction of hosting the world's first underground city. Balsam is the result of massive tunneling to build the superhighways under the Smoky Mountains, greatly facilitating trucking and several new train lines. Taking advantage of geothermal power, Balsam has become a major production center with space leased to many corporations. The city is run by a state-appointed mayor and a city council composed of the corporations leasing space. Voting power is determined by rent paid to the city. The state of Tennessee is mostly a thoroughfare for shipping interests moving from Appalachia to the west. Much of the state is uninhabited outside of some surviving cities or large towns like Memphis, Jackson, Clarksville, Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, and Johnson City. It's mostly free from marauders or nomad activity save for some wooded areas along the interstate routes. Important shipments are typically accompanied by armed escorts. The state also plays host to a major Militech training facility near the Civil War battlefield of Shiloh, which the company established when it first started challenging the Arasaka Corporation's share of the private security market. The city of Nashville, long the capital for the country music scene, has become the recording capital of the entire music scene in America, having grown to twice its size at the turn of the millennium after several major labels moved their headquarters there, along with many studios boasting the most cutting edge of recording technologies. Carrie Eurodyne opened a studio there, apparently. Many of the more hardcore rocker boys, like Johnny Silverhand, consider recording in Nashville to be equivalent to selling out to the big corporate labels, though. The state is also home to a poser gang of Elvis impersonators, taking the form of a psychotic quasi-Christian cult foretelling the return of the king, based out of a compound near the rock star's old Graceland mansion in Memphis that constantly blares his music at all hours. They support themselves with drug trafficking, fencing stolen goods, prostitution, and selling authentic holy relics of the king. Kentucky is the worst off of the Appalachian states, having been swamped with refugees and nomad types from Illinois and Ohio during the collapse. Starving mobs apparently slaughtered and ate a lot of the racing horses the state is known for, which led to wealthy landowners hiring a lot of armed security to shoot trespassers on sight. The state has been heavily impacted by pollution sweeping in from the Midwest and acid rain across the northern half of the state. The new underground highways in the Virginias and North Carolina have also had the effect of bypassing Kentucky entirely, reducing its economic role in the region. Ironically, being so economically underdeveloped now compared to neighboring states, and thus making land prices cheap, has made it a favorite spot for upwardly mobile Appalachian corporate elites to have their summer homes. Horse racing has become popular with the corporate types as a result, despite those horse-eating incidents of the collapse. Not to mention, Kentucky is one of the few places in the world where horses are still bred. The newest and most modern racetrack in the state, Ups and Downs, was built with loans from Arasaka and EBM among many other corporations. So the current Kentucky economy is basically geared towards providing services to wealthy corporate vacation types, horse racing, and little else. Moving on to the Deep South, we have Dixie, another hard-hit region of the country. They experienced some of the worst of the collapse, but take solace that they're still better off than those damn Yankees in the Northeast. Rising sea levels saw both Florida and Louisiana lose a lot of land as refugees from north and west streamed into the region, stressing the social structures of the region to the breaking point. Food riots spread as interstate shipping collapsed, all exacerbated by extreme hostility towards the newcomers. Eventually, some of this anger turned against the wealthy, who fled the region in droves as they and their businesses were attacked by mobs. Major industries left the region along with them, leaving much of the region without jobs. Unfortunately, all this anger and unrest got channeled into outright rebellion by the worst type of people, leading to the forced reorganization of several state governments by regional hate groups. One of the only two states in this group that wasn't reorganized was South Carolina, which, along with Florida, became the two states out of lockstep with the rest of Dixie. Alabama and Georgia tried to send police forces to intimidate the rogue states, but none of those patrol cars ever made it back over the border. In general, South Carolina has responded to its situation by embracing martial law. Far from anarchy, it is a harsh police state, mostly geared towards defending against assassination and terrorism from extremists coming from Alabama and Georgia. They've apparently tried to revive the economy by taxing all shipments from the rest of the South that cross their border to get to the coast. They've also gotten a little foreign investment, as a German agricultural corporation called Ackermacht has built a town in South Carolina called Grenfield to service its operations. The corporate town is apparently the site of a lot of corporate espionage from other agricultural corporations building a foothold in the region. As for the other outsider state, Florida is a shell of its former self. With large swaths of the state lost to flooding and the rising sea levels, most of the resort and tourism revenue has fled the state. There are still rich people in places like Miami, but they just ignore the state government, neither contributing taxes nor demanding services. In fact, the richest built a floating city off the coast called Atlantis. It's connected to the mainland by a causeway complete with a maglev line. It's carefully managed, a safe haven for the residents where tourists are ruthlessly price gouged. As for the rest of the state, what little funding the state has goes to funding its border patrol, which aggressively denies entry and destroys any craft trying to enter through the Gulf of Mexico. Nonetheless, the border still leaks like a sieve, and any professional that knows what they're doing can reliably get past their defenses. The state police is underfunded to the point of being useless, being unwilling to take major action against crime for lack of reinforcements, though they are apparently quite tolerant and easy to work with for the locals. Mississippi and Alabama police are known to cross over to the Panhandle to attack smuggling operations and drag perpetrators out of state to stand before a hostile judge, with the Florida state government being able to do little about it. Locals have been known to opportunistically sabotage out-of-state patrol cars when they see them, though. A few other notes on Florida. Remember those rocks the Europeans dropped on the US from orbit? One of those was dropped in the water just outside Tampa, and the resulting tidal waves and seismic instability virtually wiped out the city. It never really recovered. By 2020, its ruins house a shadow society used by cyberpunks and a clearinghouse for smuggled goods, most destined for the more restrictive states of Dixie to the north. The Florida government largely turns a blind eye to this. Another note, there is a sizable and notorious nomad gang in the Everglades which has expanded due to the inundation of seawater, apparently called Los Marineros Rojos. They get around on flat-bottom boats and similar vehicles. The marineros seem to hunt everything that moves and may have driven several local species to extinction. They've also been known to launch raids on some of the suburbs of Miami. As to the other four states of Dixie, their governments are known for being powerful, arbitrary, and corrupt. They're nicknamed the Cotton Republics, and they try to keep their populace in line with laws that are anathema to most cyberpunks. For one, virtually all firearms are banned in these states, and those that do have registered hunting rifles and shotguns are required to have a barcode tattooed on the back of their neck for identification purposes. Naturally, few Southerners actually wanted to give up their guns, so there are still many unregistered weapons despite the police performing regular sweeps and searches, which they do not require a warrant or probable cause to perform. Drugs, music, ammunition, cyberware, and many other common items are similarly outlawed. All four of these states, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, are deeply tied together at the government level and basically operate as a single unit in most matters. Alabama is run by a group called the Populist Advisory Council and a particularly loathsome character named Braxton Lowndes, a very unsubtle man that has forged the Alabama State Police into a totalitarian police force complete with black uniforms inspired by the fascist Italian black shirts. Not only are they mostly crooked thugs, the government ignores virtually all their trespasses against the rights of the citizenry. The city of Birmingham and most of its suburbs were mostly burnt to the ground during the food riots of the collapse. A small earthquake broke the city's water system, and so the firefighters were unable to effectively combat the spreading blaze caused by out-of-control looting and rioting. Rather than devote resources to rebuilding, newly empowered Braxton Lowndes arrested as many looters as he could and sentenced them to labor building a new capital in the city of Dothan in the south of the state. The original city there was razed and a new city built on a monolithic grid pattern designed to impose and depress the human mind. It doesn't help the general atmosphere of oppression that the new city hosts many harsh prisons. Across the United States, Dothan is known as Alabama's graveyard for the grim authoritarianism it represents. Moving on to the state of Georgia, which is actually considered the nice one of the Cotton Republics, we have the region's senior partner. The state weathered the collapse better than most, similar to South Carolina. The governor of Georgia and organizing ringleader of the 4 de facto state dictatorships is a man that calls himself King Gardner. Highly politically savvy, charismatic, and a master of media manipulation, Gardner has fostered a positive public reputation for himself and his state. He's built a squeaky clean image for Georgia, no longer sending state troops into other states as Alabama does, and generally projecting the image of an efficiently run and safe state. At the very least, he leaves most of the dirty work to the likes of Braxton Lowndes and his other confederates in the Cotton Republics. The crowning jewel of Gardner's propaganda efforts is the new city of Plantation, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's a model city built to convince the media that Georgia is a prosperous and influential state, an effort that is largely successful thanks to Gardner's powerful propaganda machine. Behind the curated images, Plantation is locked down with all the paranoid security a tin-horn dictator can ask for. It's regularly assaulted by cyberpunks and rebellious Southerners looking to dethrone Gardner. Neighboring Mississippi is run by Gardner's protege, Governor for Life Carroll Holmes. Of the states in the Dixie region, Mississippi has been the most aggressive in rebuilding the state economy. Governor Holmes used the promise of prison labor and free land to entice Dai Lung, a Chinese manufacturer of one-shot polymer firearms, to build factories in the state. This means there's a Chinese-managed prison camp 25 miles north of Vicksburg. The operation is aggressively taxed by the state to the point that it's only barely profitable and all the products are shipped out of state. Holmes also brought cotton production back to the state through dealing with one of the large agricultural corporations, Arcadiex, under an agreement to use a Mississippi trucking firm for their operations in the state. Arcadiex keeps trying to get out of paying its taxes, and Governor Holmes has aggressively deployed state police against the company's offices every time they try it, even engaging corporate solos. Mississippi is the only one of the Cotton Republics that still has a state senate and holds elections, but the senate is a puppet, and Holmes has crafted her employment policy so as to build a middle class in the state that is completely loyal to her, so she wins every election without any real competition. Louisiana is second only to Florida in losing land to rising sea levels. Large swaths of the Gulf Coast are smothered beneath several feet of seawater. Perhaps no American city has been more impacted by this than New Orleans. The city was already below sea level before the collapse, and the construction of more dikes and pumps were able to keep it up for a bit, but in the chaos of the economic collapse that followed, it was only a matter of time before floods took the city. These days, New Orleans has been described as a half-hearted New World Venice, with gondola services in the worst-hit areas. Everyone had to move a floor up, and most of the new construction is more concerned with durability than appearance, which had the side effect of most of the local wildlife being hunted to extinction. Most of the roads in the state haven't seen any maintenance in 10 years as of 2020, so these people are effectively living off the grid and are basically outside the reach of state authorities. The governor of Louisiana, who prefers the title Grand Poobah, is Andre Avoyelles. Where the other Cotton Republic's governors keep control with sheer authoritarianism and propaganda, Avoyelles prefers to use circuses to keep his people compliant. The greatest circus, Mardi Gras, the celebration where most of the state population and who knows how many outsiders converge on New Orleans for a great debauched party. By order of the governor, the police will make no arrests during Mardi Gras except for assaulting public servants. Drugs on every corner, sex and brawls on every street if you're adventurous enough. So far, this has worked for the governor. Let's move north to the Midwest, one of the most ecologically devastated regions of the country thanks to particularly terrible acid rain. In fact, it's commonly said there's no ecology left to conserve in these states. The forests that once covered the region are now filled with blackened husks of acid-corroded wood. Many of the small lakes and ponds are covered with scum of unknown origin. As for the Great Lakes themselves, they're so badly polluted that they've become virtually devoid of fish by 2020 in this timeline. They got so bad that Canada installed a major lock and water recycling system on the St. Lawrence River to keep the pollution out of Montreal and maritime waters. Most people live in the big cities, though that isn't much of an improvement for living standards. Detroit and Cleveland are frequently rated as the first and third most dangerous places to live in the country. Corporations have a lot of power in these states. In fact, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio have state governments run by business concerns. Wisconsin and Illinois are similarly dominated to a lesser extent. Senators from these states tend to be the most firmly pro-business, and at least one of them will vote against most environmental legislation that goes through the Senate. Let's start with Illinois, which for the first time in its history is not dominated by the Chicago metropolitan area. Remember, Chicago was quarantined and evacuated following the accidental release of a bioplague in 2012. The loss of Chicago's population and economic importance has left the state without much left to make it a major player in the region. In fact, several neighboring states are known to dump waste across the state line, and Missouri straight up annexed East St. Louis to have more control over interstate commerce. A new port was built north of Chicago to recapture the shipping that once went through the city, but the state police force is so understaffed that it's nearly impossible for the state to enforce its own regulations and taxes. As for Chicago itself, it's starting to show signs of life. The Stormtech Corporation was contracted to reclaim the city. They have contracts with 4 of the Nomad Nations to provide labor for the project, and they've been known to hire Edgerunners for salvage missions into the city. By 2020, they've reclaimed the suburbs, and some corporations have started moving back in. Perhaps that's a sign the state might start to revive. Indiana hasn't been as badly damaged ecologically as Illinois, but it doesn't have much of an economy either. In fact, the economy of the state is built entirely around running checkpoints to tax interstate shipping, taking advantage of the state's geographic position between the rest of the Midwest, the East Coast, and the southern states. With the highways to Chicago destroyed, Indianapolis has become the regional transit hub. The state has put in place strong restrictions on U.S. highway use for large shipments, forcing them to use interstate highways, all of which have been declared toll roads. Several settlements have sprung up servicing the drivers and trucks that come through state checkpoints. The state of Michigan is ground zero for the region's ecological problems. In desperation to keep the automotive industry afloat through the collapse, the state essentially paid the companies to keep operating the assembly lines at a loss. They also welcomed venture capitalist enterprises and other concerns to open more manufacturing and mining operations with very little regulatory oversight. It was cheaper to bribe EPA officials than operate conscientiously. By the time recovery from the collapse had begun, the Michigan ecosystem was virtually destroyed, with regular acid rain plaguing the region. Strip mining operations began, tearing up the landscape with no ecological concern whatsoever. The runoff from these operations polluted the Great Lakes, and many other parts of the Midwest soon followed suit in the push for industrial expansion. When you rule out places that have been literally nuked like New York or hit by a bioplague like Chicago, the only competition for violence Detroit has is the Los Angeles Metroplex on the West Coast. In 2019, the murder rates in the two cities were almost tied. The city responded to the violence by balkanizing. The municipal government built a wall around the combat zone. Higher-income neighborhoods built their own walls or hired armed security. Poorer neighborhoods made do with razor-wire barricades patrolled by volunteers. This process exacerbated the challenges faced by those living in the combat zone and low-income areas, making it harder to get to work, get food and supplies, and generally made them feel like they were living in a prison. Indeed, after upgrading the wall around the combat zone, the city declared the area a minimum security state prison. The side facing Detroit has the tightest security, while the side facing the countryside is more lax. Some of the walled-off high-income areas are nonetheless very nice to live in, having all the conveniences of modern life. The state of Missouri is one of the only states in the region that has avoided the extreme acid rain problem and has thus emerged as the de facto agricultural center of the region despite drought problems. It is also distinguished by having a relatively clean and functional government, largely free of corporate influence. The state government has taken advantage of its relative stability and broad economic base to strong-arm land from weaker neighboring states. Namely, Kansas City and St. Louis have been expanded to incorporate their sister cities across state lines. They have had problems with the Missouri River silting up so bad it's become too shallow for freight shipping. They've been experimenting with hover barge technology to address the problem. Over to the east, Ohio is a heavily urbanized state, and by contrast to Missouri, its government is almost entirely controlled by corporate interests. People can still vote, but the only polling station is in Cincinnati City Hall, so very few do. What's worse, the infighting between those corporate interests is so severe that the government is extremely inconsistent. New laws are rolled out and reversed with some regularity. The rampant corruption is the main factor holding Ohio back from being a dominant player in the region. The profusion of factories, mostly chemical and light manufacturing, and large cities has made Ohio a match for Michigan in terms of pollution. Most middle-income families have air purifiers in their homes and carry breathing masks when they go outside. The landscape near the cities or the lake is dead, brown, and eroding. Under corporate pressure, the state built a new dedicated port called Catawba on the Lake Erie coast, occupying the now empty townships of Marblehead and Lakeside. A giant causeway connects the mainland to Kelly Island, equipped to load and unload freighters of any size that pass underneath it. Trucks constantly swarm the roads between Catawba and the rest of the state. Wisconsin is not quite as under corporate control as Ohio, but they still have great influence in state politics, leading to Milwaukee and Green Bay being turned into semi-industrial towns. The agricultural industry was devastated by acid rain and suffered a slow death over the years, with most farmers losing their farms. It's said most of the grass left in the state can be found on indoor golf courses catering to the corporate elite. There's a movement in the western half of the state to secede to the Great Plains region. There is a group of farmers in the state determined to remain in the dairy industry, having constructed an arcology called Yellerco. It's a great big dome filled with cows, and thus is the only arcology known to have a major indoor pollution problem. The Great Plains region actually avoided the worst chaos of the collapse, save for a prolonged drought that lasted most of the 90s. Travel in the region became so inhospitable that most nomad groups avoided it, and the remains of those that did not can be found in the vast parched stretches between the sparse towns. Agricultural corporations took advantage of the struggling farmers to buy up land. Hope for a quick return on investment was dashed in the year 2000 by what people in the region simply remember as the brush fire. Huge portions of Montana and North Dakota were consumed, and portions of other states as well. Most people believe careless nomads started the fire along Interstate 94. The brush fire produced the largest fire curtain ever seen. Conventional firefighting tactics were useless. The U.S. Army was called in and destroyed a huge area in controlled burns, digging fire breaks and sowing fire-retardant chemicals. Eventually they contained the fire against the Missouri River in North Dakota, where it finally burned itself out. As many as 57 smaller fires broke out due to ash carried on the wind, some as far away as Wyoming and South Dakota. The heat from the blaze disrupted weather patterns for the rest of the year. The destruction of the environment, public infrastructure, and private property was immense. Vigilante attacks against nomads and other transients soon followed, being blamed for the disaster, and most of the Great Plains states adopted strict migrant laws, leading most nomad groups to give the region a wide berth. In the decades since the brush fire, the agricorps have developed the region into the nation's breadbasket. They even have fields illegally planted across the northern border into Canada, so fierce is the competition for land between the corporations. They are known to hire teams to harvest competitors' fields and steal their crops. Constant friction exists between these corporations and the native small farmers and city dwellers. The strongest state in the region, and an exception to some of the things I just said, is Iowa. The acid rain problems that ravaged the eastern regions of the state led to less interest in the state from corporations. The population's fear and hatred of the agricorps has made them cling to a small-town America mentality, being concerned for one another's well-being and intensely distrustful of outsiders. This has led to the family farm and small businesses surviving in the western areas better than most anywhere else in the country. Thus, cities like Cedar Rapids and Waterloo have mostly emptied, with non-agricultural businesses moving to Davenport and Des Moines, while the displaced farmers found their way to Sioux City and Fort Dodge. The center of Iowa society these days is the new city of Silo, constructed with state funds and donations from small landowners near the ghost town of Carroll. It's operated as a state-run cooperative, selling produce in bulk quantities to compete with the major corporations. It's also a switchboard for other services available, connecting Iowans with local providers as an alternative to the big corporations. Moving north to Minnesota, the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul are the only major cities left in the state. Duluth survives as a dedicated port. St. Cloud and Moorhead are transportation byways, but all are tiny compared to the Twin Cities. Most of the northern areas of the state are uninhabited and filled with lakes of accumulated acid rain, rendering the groundwater thoroughly poisoned. The only place of note there is the new city of Deadwood, a short-term settlement built for the express purpose of logging as much of the region's forests as possible before the acid rain makes all the lumber unusable. The place is overrun with drugs and other illegal diversions for the workers that live there. Local Minnesotans have been known to protest the clear-cutting with Molotov cocktails and occasional shooting. The farming takes place in the southwestern quadrant of the state, on land largely controlled by the agricorps. There is a constant state of tension between the civilian government and Twin City urbanites on one side and the agricorps on the other, each locking the other out of dominating state politics. On the other side of the Great Plains, eastern Montana was badly damaged by the brush fire, with most residents abandoning the area for the Dakotas. Almost all of that land was bought up by the agricorps, who turned it into endless fields. Most of the state population lives in overcrowded communities and ranches on the western side of the state. The corporations have more or less taken over Montana state politics, where they have killed several attempts to cede the corporate side of the state to North Dakota and thus remove corporate influence from Montana. The corporations built the new city of Grand Prairie with the intention of making it the second biggest city in the state. Every agricorp has a headquarters there, with subsidized housing as a perk for all their staff, which has helped tip state politics in their favor. It's basically what Night City was supposed to be, a clean business district surrounded by pleasant suburbs. The state of Nebraska was devastated by the drought of 1998 and has never really recovered, limping along as a junior partner of the Great Plains region thanks to plentiful corporate investment, which of course gave them a commanding voice in the state government. There are several towns, new and old, that primarily serve the agricorp's needs. The city of Omaha is mostly abandoned, though. When the rocks were dropped on Colorado Springs at the close of the Orbital War, many residents thought Omaha would be next since it housed a NORAD headquarters. That didn't happen, but the city was mostly abandoned preemptively and few returned. On to the Dakotas. North Dakota is the most corporate-dominated of the Great Plains states, for the simple fact that a consortium of 3 corporations own almost all of the state land outright, thanks to a combination of tax scalping, mortgage sharking, leveraged buyouts, and foreclosures. The consortium consists of Petrochem, Arcadiex, and New East Asia Agricultural. These companies effectively rule even as the state governments pay lip service to democracy. Most laws exist to protect their business and prevent conflict between them. What labor laws exist are mostly for preventing the 3 from poaching each other's employees. Furthermore, the grain industry is just about the only industry the state has, meaning the whole thing could easily collapse if there's another major drought or something. Smuggling goods into the state is a very lucrative enterprise if you're willing to risk the consortium's enforcers. South Dakota actually managed to stave off the worst of the drought by imposing strict water conservation policies, though the conservation of Lake Oahe caused the Missouri River to be reduced to a trickle and made the situation in Nebraska worse. Agricultural corporations invested heavily in the state, but the state government fell back on antitrust laws to prevent them from taking over the state the same way they had elsewhere in the nation. There have actually been some big changes to Mount Rushmore. They added some additional heads to it, namely Franklin Roosevelt, JFK, and President Seward, and some cyberpunk shot JFK's head with a Stinger missile, with reconstruction to begin in 2021. Wyoming's state government quietly fell apart once the drought hit, on the brink of collapsing entirely in 1997. But then the state had a sudden influx of radical socialists pour in, attaining a majority voice in the legislature and then installing themselves in government as the Wyoming People's Council. This immediately drew a wide swath of left-wing idealists from across the country, a dedicated base of manpower that they used to pull the state out of the collapse. Observers have noted that getting Wyoming out of the collapse wasn't much of an accomplishment, not to mention the questionable way they did it. Oddly, they denationalized the Yellowstone and Grand Teton national parks and unified them into a giant recreational area. They quintupled the entrance fee and posted armed guards at every entrance, also making some camping improvements with regular janitorial services. Basically, they've turned America's most famous national parks into an upscale vacation site for European corporate and other capitalist pigs. In addition, many corporations avoid doing business with the state or even routing cargo through it, as there have been several cases of the state seizing shipments for businesses big and small for the good of the people. In most respects, Wyoming is economically cut off from the rest of the country, just as the socialists intended. Rumor has it that the Wyoming People's Guard, a combination of the State Patrol and National Guard, has built a gulag of sorts somewhere in the northeast corner of the state, though no substantial evidence of this has ever emerged. The Pacific Northwest, which as a political unit includes Hawaii, is one of the most powerful regions of the country. For one, these 4 states include what is now the largest West Coast port, Seattle, and the only West Coast port that isn't part of a free state, along with a great deal of resources like lumber and natural food production that's becoming scarce in the rest of the states. The politicians of these states are known to be very serious in asserting their state interests at the national level. The status of Seattle as the major West Coast port has transformed the region and put it at the forefront of the American cultural wave. Many rockers make pilgrimage to the rebuilt ruins of the Northwest. As for Hawaii, the United States military co-opted the entire island of Oahu in 1997 and basically turned it into one big military base. All of the state remains under martial law to this date. Honolulu Airport still serves as a transport hub for the islands, part because it allows the military to process and clear everyone. A homegrown radical leftist movement called the Hawaiian Liberation Front has been trying to get the military to end martial law through increasingly violent tactics, including ambushes and bombs. Soldiers tend to travel in groups because of this. Despite all of that, the islands remain a popular vacation spot for corporates and drug kingpins alike, in part because the lush tropical environment remains essentially intact despite climate challenges, especially if they can afford the extraterritorial concealed weapons permits. Gun control is very strict in the islands, and military police are responsible for enforcing the law across the state. Those caught with unregistered firearms are summarily shot. The main point of military buildup on the islands is Kaina Station, built on scenic Kaina Point on Oahu, absorbing older Coast Guard and military presences in the area. It's a good place to go if you want to find lots of military equipment and thousands of trained killers. Of note, the base is equipped with anti-re-entry kinetic missile defenses, intended to keep the base safe in case the European Space Agency decides to start dropping rocks again. The state of Idaho, the simple way to say it is that they got taken over by neo-Nazis and then had a civil war. In short, several white supremacy groups had built up in the state in the 90s, and they reacted to the collapse by blaming all the problems on racial minorities, to the point of declaring a race war for the purification of the United States. At the height of the collapse, they seized control of Idaho and renamed Boise to Aryan City. They soon began harassing anyone they deemed unwanted in increasingly violent ways. As the collapse waned, minorities and resistant Anglos fought back, ultimately resulting in a 10-month struggle that ousted the supremacist government, and a group of guerrilla leaders ran a provisional government for a while until the state government could be rebuilt. The remainders of the supremacists fled into the forests of Idaho and founded a settlement called Berchtesgaden. It's more like an armed camp that changes location from time to time, from which they've flipped the script and begun waging a guerrilla campaign of their own against the state. Washington was hit by a series of catastrophic ecological and economic disasters during the collapse. First, Boeing, a major employer in the state, collapsed in 1995, reorganizing as a small AV company. Massive droughts and forest fires hurt the state's lumber and agricultural industries. Then a Korean oil tanker illegally loaded with toxic waste for disposal was rammed by a destroyer that had lost control off the coast. The resulting spill contaminated the entirety of Puget Sound and killed off that year's salmon runs. This all happened over a 3-year period. With Boeing, farming, lumber, and fishing industries all crippled, the state went into the worst of the collapse in a dire state. Raising taxes on corporations to raise revenues simply resulted in a corporate exodus, and before long the state government dissolved. There was a state of anarchy for several years until California declared itself a free state. The U.S. government, looking to boost trade with Asia, wanted to build up a port not controlled by a semi-autonomous free state government. Thus they poured resources into building up Seattle as the largest port on the West Coast, including a massive floating dry dock and warehouse facility covering the south end of Puget Sound. The state was wildly rejuvenated, and local citizens rebuilt the state government with a new parliamentary structure, rapidly becoming one of the most stable and wealthiest state governments. A few areas of note: leakages of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in 2004 have rendered the area into a toxic wasteland. Only crazy people try to stay there for any length of time. Waste has also leached into the Columbia River, poisoning it and destroying a large chunk of the Northwest fishing industry. Elsewhere, a group of naturalists have attempted to return to living off the land in the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula, which would be going well if nomads didn't periodically come through the area and take what they wanted. As for Oregon, the eastern half of Oregon was largely abandoned during the collapse, with the homeless and many nomad types preying on isolated villages. Many migrated to Portland, leading to the expansion of the city suburbs until they reached the borders of Salem. The state implemented extremely strict migrant laws to address the nomad problem. Nomads and the homeless were effectively deterred from entering the state. This has actually helped the state become a desirable tourist and vacation spot, as it has made the state's pristine state parks easier to enjoy. The state actually has a specialized police force called the Oregon Environmental Patrol dedicated to keeping them that way. Attempts to attract businesses from the disasters striking Washington largely failed. Instead, Oregon's main economic resource has become water, the most important resource for that part of the country. The state gets more rain than it uses and exports water to other states for a good price. The state has also invested in an agricultural venture called Horse Heaven. It's an experimental, privately owned cooperative that employs natural techniques instead of hormonally induced growth in robotic machinery. Horse Heaven's fields cover most of Morrow County as well as parts of Umatilla and Gilliam counties. There have been rumors of them growing peyote, poppies, hemp, and an unusual variety of mushrooms, but the state has dragged their feet on investigating, despite, or perhaps because, the State Patrol uses Horse Heaven as a regional base of operations. Violence and espionage are on the rise in that part of Oregon, incidentally. The state has also converted to the same parliamentary style of government as Washington. The West is a collection of states that are sort of arbitrarily collected together because they didn't fit in the other groupings. People sometimes call them the rest. In general, global warming and drought has made these already hot and dry states increasingly inhospitable. Most of the greenery, ranches, and farms dried up and blew away. Nowhere else in the country have small towns been so thoroughly abandoned for the larger cities. Most of them simply don't exist on the map anymore, and those that do are mostly multi-generational homesteaders stubbornly attached to the land. The landscape is dominated by highways crossing over wasteland and dust bowls. Skywalks between buildings in the cities have become common to avoid the heat. Economically, these states don't have a lot going for them. Smuggling across the border from Mexico is a rampant problem. The federal government's primary interest in these states is the wide open space they provide for military pilot training. The state of Arizona actually has fewer problems with smugglers than other states, the smuggling routes mostly serving markets in California or the East, so they have more funds to spend on internal development. The cities of Phoenix and Tucson have thus managed to thrive around green belts producing whatever crops can stand the weather, but the rest of the state is a barren wasteland, home to nomads and a few Native American groups stubbornly clinging to the land. It's fashionable for businesses, especially those catering to passing nomads, to adopt the Old West cowboy aesthetic. One oddity: during the collapse, a domed city enveloping Horseshoe Dam northeast of Phoenix sprung up seemingly overnight. It's a completely closed environment, and nobody knows any outsiders that have been inside, though some purchasing agents briefly appear from time to time. The main thing they import is hydroelectric power. Other than that, Alpha is entirely self-sustaining. The best intelligence suggests the founder and leader of this settlement is a charismatic and wealthy African, but that's as much as anyone knows. Arkansas was very badly hit by the wasting plague in 2000. The state had so few funds that they couldn't even distribute information about the plague to the populace. Thus, the disease spread through Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and the Ozarks like wildfire. The dead couldn't be buried fast enough, and the population was badly overtaxed, leading to the spread of other diseases like cholera. Texas and Tennessee closed their borders with the state for a while. By the time the plagues had run their course, only the scavengers were thriving in Arkansas. The remaining rural population migrated to Little Rock, incentivized by the state government basically letting people take their pick of furniture sets left behind by the families that had died. These days, most of the lawns in Little Rock have been converted into gardens and many empty houses into greenhouses. Some people have made good money selling exotic plants. Use your imagination. Effectively, Arkansas is now the city-state of Little Rock. Lack of attention towards the rest of the state has allowed the Ozarks to become a haven for criminals and others looking to disappear. Colorado hasn't fared too badly since the Colorado Springs hit in 2008. Denver remains a hub for coast-to-coast travel. Agriculture has suffered due to the drying climate, but genetically engineered sheep for the rich corporate market has kept the food industry aloft. The dude ranches also still make a living, giving disaffected urbanites the cowboy experience for a week. A significant portion of the state's tax revenue comes from Biotechnica, which bought the northwest corner of the state during the collapse, when the whole area was crawling with nomads, and uses the area to raise cattle. Their regional base of operations is a new town called White City. As for Colorado Springs, there have been no serious rebuilding efforts since the rock hit. Those that still live there live with no utilities and services, mostly scavenging valuables from the ruins to sell to passing nomads in exchange for food, ammunition, or passage out. The freeways around the city are still clogged with the rusting hulks of vehicles left there since the rock hit, drained of gas and stripped of anything valuable. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex was written off as a total loss by the government after it was found to be totally sealed off by rubble, and there was no sign of survivors. No attempt at recovering personnel or equipment has been made. Locals call the city Colorado Sprung, and others have grandiosely called it the grave of the American dream. At some point, a technology-hating Luddite cult called the Brotherhood of the Desolate Soul also took root among the residents of the city. Kansas, once a breadbasket of the nation, was particularly devastated by the drying climate. Once verdant fields turned to dust bowls. The entire western half of the state has been designated a new Indian reservation and abandoned to its fate, not being eligible for state funds. State troopers rarely go more than 30 miles past the I-35-I-70 interchange, restricting their activity to the eastern half of the state. State justice is quick, often arbitrary, and with minimal provisions for appeals. It's common for offenders to be jailed without a hearing and then released a few days or weeks later without explanation. Kansas City was fully annexed by Missouri, if you recall, and Kansas tried to protest, but the move was beneficial enough for the residents that they made it official. In some ways, Kansas seems to be going the way of Arkansas, but they do have Hydropolis going for them. Hydropolis is a new settlement built by wealthy Kansas natives for the sole purpose of hydroponics. The effort drew Biotechnica investment and has proven to be both cost-effective and successful. Other towns in the state have started building their own hydroponics plants. New Mexico used to be primarily desert. Now it is entirely desert. Most of the state is entirely unlivable. Santa Fe was abandoned both due to environmental concerns and terrorist action from a separatist Native American movement operating from a new city called Red Mesa. That movement is formed from a number of Native American groups from across the country, mostly Navajo and Cherokee, that chose New Mexico as the place for their new nation, mostly because of the federal government's neglect of the area. They declare themselves as the unified American nation, denying the legitimacy of the U.S. government and staking territory running from U.S. 64 in the north to the San Felipe Indian Reservation in the south, from the Jicarilla Apache Indian Reservation in the west to the Santa Fe National Forest in the east. There have been numerous attacks on U.S. truckers driving through the Terry on I-25 and clashes between the Native Americans and the New Mexico militia. Red Mesa and Albuquerque, the new state capital, are the only relatively healthy towns left in the state. Otherwise, Las Cruces mostly exists as a jumping-off point for smuggling operations into Mexico, and there's a group of cyborgs that set up a community in the Carlsbad Caverns to escape the heat. The U.S. government has also started using parts of the state for weapon testing again. Oklahoma suffered as much as the other states of the West in the collapse, but its people have proven resilient in rebuilding the state as a transport hub, especially in maintaining and building new expressways facilitating shipments traveling east and west, especially for those wishing to avoid passing through Texas, which has imposed high tariffs since it declared independence. Such shipments are sometimes targeted by Texan hijackers and raiders. Boise City in the Panhandle is basically a paramilitary outpost filled with solos and nomads that are hired to guard shipments moving through the area. The only bright spots in the local economies are a few small agricultural businesses springing up along the rivers marking the border with Texas. Most of these are apparently spin-offs of a Texas firm. Similar firms are poised to move into the state if these prove successful. Finally, we come to the Free States. Born of a compromise intended to prevent a civil war, these 6 states are quasi-independent and, in practice, autonomous regarding federal authority. The first of the Free States, Texas, officially changed its name to the Republic of Texas, mostly just to spite the federal government. The Texas Rangers and National Guard have been unified into a peacekeeping force headquartered in the city of College Station, which is also the site of the state's new military academy. The Rangers are a full-blown military police organization with a reputation as one of the harshest law enforcement agencies in the country. State law openly discriminates between those with a Texas Republic-issued identification number and those without, the latter having far fewer rights. The Rio Grande is patrolled by over 100 state-of-the-art hovercraft targeting illegal aliens and smugglers, though they are still incredibly undermanned for the sheer volume of people and contraband crossing. Larger hovercraft and hydrofoils patrol the Gulf Coast, usually deploying from larger motherships for counter-smuggling and oil rig security operations. They also have an air force, mostly planes seized when the state nationalized U.S. military airfields in the region. Aside from the oil economy, the state has received investments from agricorps developing large stretches of wasteland into arable land using underground irrigation, making Texas a big food producer. Surprisingly, Texas has also installed windmills for power generation along the Gulf Coast, though they need to be shut down every hurricane season. The locals are big on economic independence on both the state and individual level. Texas is the only state that has no social security, no food stamps, no welfare, and no dole of any kind. A few other notable developments. The city of Galveston ceased to exist for a while thanks to rising sea levels and terrible hurricanes. The financial firm Merrill, Asukaga & Finch provided funds for the reconstruction in exchange for choice pieces of land, which they used to build a series of recreational facilities on shore and New Galveston, a mega-resort a mile from shore connected by a causeway. It's an unflattering squat dome structure built to withstand hurricanes, so it's a bit of an eyesore, but it's popular with summer travelers, and riding out a hurricane there has become a fad. There are a few dozen deaths every year from guests that don't seem to understand that storms are best weathered from inside the dome. Further south on the coast, The city of Corpus Christi absorbed a lot of shipping that previously ran through Galveston, making it one of the most important and prosperous cities in the southern United States. Sudden economic expansion and constant maritime and overland traffic has resulted in the growth of a massive transient population. There are enormous nomad encampments on the border of the city. Hundreds of thousands inhabit temporary camps, vehicle camps, and squatter villages, while countless others reside in the city proper's hotels and coffin shops. This situation is a perfect storm for smuggling and other criminal activity, not to mention ideal for cyberpunks. The Texas Rangers are perpetually frustrated, unable to fully contain the rampant crime, yet they can't shut down the area. It's too important a source of state revenue. Lastly are the Sherman Disposal Centers, SDCs, a lesser-known and sinister aspect of the Texas economy. These are high-security prisons built out in the barren West Texas plains. Each one is a simple concrete container, a mile wide with walls 10 meters high. The concrete walls and floors are 2 meters thick, and there are no ceilings, no shelter. Food and water is dropped once a day by patrolling guards, and there isn't enough to go around. The only sanitary facilities are 2-inch wide drain holes scattered around the enclosure. Occasionally, prisoners are moved into temporary holding tanks while the SDCs are purged with napalm. Cannibalism, rat hunts, and gladiatorial events are common. Escape attempts are rare, as whenever someone manages to stack enough dead bodies to get over the wall, they usually die in the harsh desert countryside. This hellish environment is where Texas sends incorrigible felons for incarceration, as well as imported out-of-state prisoners, which Texas charges the U.S. government a disposal fee for. Management and guards are on a security contract from the Arasaka Corporation, which installed anti-air missiles after a few aerial breakout attempts. The existence of the SDCs is not publicized, and few Texas residents are aware of them. The second free state, Alaska, not only remains a big oil producer, but has also taken advantage of the warming climate to become a breadbasket state. Large tracts of central Alaska and the Yukon River Valley have been converted to farmland. Petrochem, which uses crops to create biofuel, even set up a big agribusiness city called Philogia smack in the middle of the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, despite popular outcry and ongoing eco-terrorist action. Apparently someone managed to smuggle a polar bear into some poor junior executive's office, which killed him and several employees. Relations with the Alaskan native population are surprisingly congenial, likely because they've made a lot of money from the corporate investments. The state used to have a strong shipping trade across the Bering Strait with Russia, but that evaporated shortly after Alaska became a free state when the Russians quietly occupied St. Lawrence and Nunavik to strengthen their position in the area. The federal government is content to let the free states sweat over it and not lift a finger to help remove the Russians. Despite seizing much of the federal military equipment left in the state government has been reluctant to attack directly owing to their small population. Instead, they've been looking into hiring independent contractors and security companies like Lazarus to take care of the problem for them. Domestically, Alaska actually has surprisingly strict gun control. Concealable handguns smaller than a Colt 45 are not allowed. Larger pistols, shotguns, and non-automatic rifles are unrestricted, however, given that much of the state is still wilderness. When the collapse hit, the people of the United States no longer had the money for gambling, and thus the state of Nevada suffered. They only barely weathered the storm by offering incredibly cheap discount vacation packages to European and Asian corporations. The rest of the state rode the coattails of the gambling casinos and the spenders they brought in, desperate people throwing themselves into whatever jobs they could find, no matter how demeaning. In time, the Nevada economy converted entirely to the service industry, namely serving the desires of excitement-seeking tourists. Reno and Las Vegas remained popular for gambling, but the new cities of Arcadia and Los Juegos were designed purely for pleasure and nothing else. Highly expensive places to visit, but you can find any sort of entertainment imaginable there. Gambling, designer drugs, high and low-class prostitution, wilderness activities, racing, combat sports, they have it all. Nevada is also home to Carson Mint, a chain of high-end biosculpting parlors with some of the best experts in the business willing to perform illegal biosculpts, no questions asked. Nothing is really illegal here. In fact, there is effectively no law. There's a well-armed border patrol to keep out nomads, but citizens are expected to sort things out between themselves. There are also no gun laws. Assaults and murders are merely frowned upon because they upset the clientele. Nevada came out of the collapse flush with enough money to purchase its free state status from the federal government in 2003, when the Federals were desperate for cash. The lawless state of Nevada is a headache for neighboring states, who often mount extensive border control and custom checking operations at the state line to catch all the contraband that flows directly into the state, which sometimes includes outright slaves. The Californias have apparently been known to force cargo flights headed to Nevada down for confiscation before they can even reach the state. The east side of Nevada is another matter, being largely ignored by the state government. It's one of the only places where small-town America has survived, and is generally a good place to disappear, if a dangerous one. Northeastern Nevada in particular has become a haven for the last of the mountain men. Comprised mostly of Native Americans, but including all sorts, the locals there are extremely hostile to outsiders, and truckers moving through the state tend to do so in heavily armed convoys. Amongst the free states, Utah is most said to have failed to benefit much from its free state status. Utah remains a bit of an isolated backwater, though they have become more or less self-sufficient. The Mormon Church dedicated itself to providing aid during the collapse, a time when many believers thought the rapture was at hand, and earned a lot of goodwill from the populace by providing food and shelter. Thus, with the church as a centerpiece, Utah actually weathered the catastrophes fairly well, and the Mormon faith saw a surge of conversions unprecedented in modern times. Many church leaders were soon voted into government office. They became a free state in 2014 and since adopted policies isolationist even by free state standards. As a result, they are relatively poor, but the people of Utah largely seem unbothered and happy with their lot. There isn't much to interest the jaded cyberpunk in the state, but there are rumors of an anti-Mormon resistance group that views the ascension of the Mormon Church as the first step to a new American Inquisition. Moving on, you'll remember that California split in two in 2012. Southern California, commonly called SoCal, comprises San Luis Obispo, Kings, Tulare, and Inyo counties, and all counties to the south of those. LA hasn't managed to completely cover the entirety of the state, but it is the sole dominating force of the state's politics. The Los Angeles Metroplex covers the coast from Santa Barbara to San Diego and as far east as San Bernardino. The eastern area of the state has gotten so hot as to be nigh uninhabitable. Areas like Death Valley and others are entirely empty wastelands, save for the occasional nomad group. The Metroplex itself is an urban hell, rotted with pollution and acid rain. Dense ground fogs mix with the smog to create an acidic toxic soup. Masks and air vendors are everywhere. Everyone owns thin-hooded dusters with knee-high boots, all made of special acid-resistant fabric. Policing this mess is an impossible task, one that the Highway Patrol and urban police have leveraged to get real power from the state government. The South California Highway Patrol has total authority outside the city limits and near that within them. They have a covert operations section that evokes comparison to the Gestapo, though they aren't nearly that cruel. The mean toughness of these enforcers is a big part of what keeps the SoCal government in power despite the many disgruntled and heavily armed urbanites. Lastly, we come to Northern California, also called North Cal, comprised of Monterey, Fresno, and Mono counties, and all counties north of them. As I mentioned before, the chief reason for the split between North and South in California was a push from the North to no longer be dominated by the politics of the LA Metroplex, which tended to be very pro-urban and anti-rural, and they got their wish. By the standards of the rest of the country, Northern California has done pretty well. The climate has stayed pleasant, the state government has kept massive agricorps from taking over food production, and its national parks remain intact such that they remain a big tourism draw. The state operates its own international trade agreements without the middleman of the federal government, resulting in the Bay Area becoming an exceptionally busy port. They had hoped to become the main intermediary for shipments moving into the rest of the states, but the federal government invested in Seattle to prevent that from happening. The state has become affluent, partly because all the affluent people that wanted out of LA moved north. This has had the effect of spiking costs of living wherever they settled and subsequently a mounting homelessness problem. There are two new cities in Northern California. One of them is State Line, a town built on the border between North and South California by a major trucking company. It's mostly dominated by weighing stations and customs facilities to facilitate interstate shipping, having a police presence from both sides of the border it straddles. It's also a major smuggling hub for both states. The second is, of course, the infamous Night City. I have an in-depth breakdown of Night City's history and specifics of various districts in another video, which I encourage you to check out. We'll cover it briefly here. Richard Knight founded the city in the 90s with idealistic notions of a clean city isolated from the chaos of the collapse. After his assassination by organized crime, the city basically descended into a state of near anarchy until corporate troops staged an intervention in the early 2010s. Between then and 2020, Night City became a relatively stable, if heavily corporate-controlled place to live, but with an ongoing booster gang problem. Going through all the other parts of the country really kind of helps explain why people view Night City as a land of opportunity instead of just a hellhole. Many parts of the country are much worse. Again, check out that video if you want more focused lore for Night City. For now, we'll be moving on to the Fourth Corporate War. The Fourth Corporate War is another topic that I already have a dedicated video for, but we will hit the highlights. This conflict began over a dispute between two maritime companies looking to acquire the assets of a third that had declared bankruptcy in 2021. One of those companies hired the Japanese company Arasaka, arguably the largest and most powerful private security and weapons manufacturing company in the world, to secure its interests. The other hired Arasaka's biggest competitor, Militech, primary supplier of the United States military and itself a formidable private military company. The opening Shadow War phase saw covert actions taken against the maritime companies and the security companies' assets all over the world. Over time, it became less about the contracts and more about Militech and Arasaka slugging it out to destroy the other. Outright warfare broke out in 2022. Indiscriminate autonomous weapons were unleashed in the sea lanes, coastal cities were hit with bioweapons, and both sides encouraged proxy wars against customers of the other. There were even skirmishes in low Earth orbit. Both corporations also invested heavily in freelancers, Edgerunner types, to supplement their forces. Militech being an American company, and Arasaka having many offices, factories, and contracts in the country, the United States saw a significant amount of fighting. Militech leveraged its great economic impact to keep the federal and state governments from interfering, and both companies had lobbyists working around the clock to mollify the politicians. It worked for a while. The three biggest flashpoints in the states were Night City, where Arasaka had its American headquarters, Chicago, where both companies had large offices in the rebuilding city, and Los Angeles, where Arasaka also had a regional office. Eventually, the government put National and State Guard units on standby, as well as some regular military units. The fighting in Chicago grew so destructive that the efforts to rebuild the city were brought to a halt and even reversed, as Arasaka unleashed bioweapons on the city in an effort to deny the territory to Militech. The folk Nomad Nation retaliated with help from Medicorp, which was also on contract in the city at the time, blowing up both Arasaka and Militech offices. The fighting also triggered a war in orbit, though it was more of a revolution. The High Riders, a mostly West African demographic of workers on the orbital habitats, grew tired of the chaos and seized control of the recently constructed habitat O'Neill 2, dropping dozens of lunar rocks around the world to make their point and causing widespread destruction. This led to the formation of the High Rider Confederation, a government body that seized control of both O'Neill habitats and the lunar cities of Tycho and Copernicus. As this was a massive loss for the EEC's orbital dominance, the United States and Japan were the first to recognize the High Rider Confederation. Perhaps the most destructive element of the war actually happened in cyberspace, though. Early in the conflict, Militech contracted Raish Bartmoss, one of the best and most misanthropic netrunners in the world. They gave him unprecedented resources and access. Eventually, Arasaka went after him, an effort that ended with an orbital weapon leveling his apartment block in Night City. However, he left his greatest weapon on a timer should he die. It unleashed a digital bomb across the net, embedded in the very protocols used by every machine connected to the net. The consequences were not immediately apparent, but by late 2022, people were starting to recognize that the data on every net-connected machine was becoming corrupted and unreliable with increasing frequency. Additionally, rogue lethal attack programs dubbed Rabbids, roving autonomous Bartmoss drones, would start proliferating across the net. If that wasn't enough, countless military-grade AI were unshackled and mutated into extremely dangerous entities. This disaster would be called the data crash. Eventually, world governments decided enough was enough. The Europeans started nationalizing assets of both companies within their territories. The Japanese government almost broke down, but they saved face by repudiating Arasaka and deploying the SDF against them to seize control of their assets in Japan. Arasaka CEO Ki Arasaka, eldest son of de facto company head Saburo Arasaka, fled to Night City, California and gathered forces to play for time to negotiate a deal. In the US, President Elizabeth Kress declared a state of emergency and took control of Militech. Militech's CEO, Donald Lundy, was a former Marine Corps general, and she used a secret clause to reactivate his commission, thus putting him in her chain of command. She directly ordered him to submit or face court-martial. Thus, the government effectively seized control of Militech and began moving on Arasaka assets. By this time in 2023, Ki Arasaka had turned Night City into an armed camp. Most of the civilians were driven out of the central city as Arasaka troops and tanks flooded the streets, and North California forces surrounded the city. President Kress persuaded the governor to allow additional special forces from Militech and the U.S. military into the area. A man named Morgan Blackhand, arguably the most capable edgerunner in the world and frequently employed by Militech, spearheaded the attack in Night City. The plan was to attack Arasaka Tower in 3 teams, with the ultimate goal of leveling the tower with a nuclear device and acquiring or destroying the database Arasaka had kept disconnected from the net since they realized the data crash was happening. Johnny Silverhand and a group of high-profile edgerunners would lead one team to attack the upper floors, where the Soul Killer lab was. Unbeknownst to him, that operation was a decoy to the main objective. However, the attack did not go as planned. The exact reason is unclear, but the nuclear device detonated in the upper floors instead of the foundations as planned, resulting in a destructive air blast that ripped through central Night City. 12,000 were instantly incinerated in the vicinity of the tower, while 500,000 more were injured. Ki Arasaka was not at the tower at the time, but his dead body was found later off-site. Mop-up fighting continued for 2 years as Militech and national forces quelled remaining pockets of fighting, but the Night City Holocaust was the punctuation mark at the end of the war. Netwatch finally deployed a countermeasure to the data crash, namely by sabotaging the protocols used to connect to the net. The old net was officially down. Between the failure of the net and the damage to the sea lanes wrought by the combatants of the war, the infrastructure of the world was badly damaged. Particulates in the atmosphere from the orbital strikes, nukes, burning of cities and agricultural land would tinge the skies red for the following 2 years, which eventually died down to brilliant sunrises and sunsets for many years to come. This gave the following era its colloquial name, the Time of the Red, also called the Red Decades. We don't have nearly as fleshed out a timeline or specific information about each state for the Time of the Red compared to the 2020 setting, so we will be going over a timeline, but with a lot more generalities about how the world has been affected. Before I get to that, I want to acknowledge a contradiction in the sources here. The older Sourcebook says the first free state was Texas, and it happened around 1999, with Alaska, California, Utah, and Nevada following. The newer Cyberpunk Red book says California was the first, and it happened around 1993, followed by Texas, and then several states that weren't free states in the 2020 setting, like the Dakotas, Washington, and Oregon. Alaska is mentioned as a free state in an add-on to the game, while Utah and Nevada are not mentioned at all. For the sake of maintaining consistency between the editions in this video, I'm treating this as those new states becoming free states in the 2020s after the Fourth Corporate War. It doesn't really change anything for the red setting, so I think that's okay. The free state lineup changes again in the 2077 setting, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So, in the aftermath of the Night City Holocaust, the government spun up the propaganda machine. Kress blamed the nuclear blast on an Arasaka area denial strategy. This made sense to the population, as Arasaka had used similar tactics in Chicago and in fact really did have such a device in the foundations of the tower. Thus, the foreign corporation recklessly blowing up American cities became an easy target for public anger. All of Arasaka's charters to operate in the United States were revoked, and the corporation was banned from American shores. Elizabeth Kress came out of the crisis as a wildly popular national hero and a de facto dictator under her state of emergency. The destruction of the urban war and the data crash in particular radically changed many things about the country. For starters, starting around 2026, a new diaspora began of people leaving devastated urban centers to reclaim many of the smaller towns and cities that were abandoned during the collapse of the 1990s. Nomads helped in this, organizing convoys between cities. The ongoing danger of the sea lanes and the data crash destroying most digital databases made the international corporation model simply untenable as they had been. Many local branches simply collapsed, with smaller companies springing up locally to take up the slack. Many of these companies were built on resources from the large-scale looting of tech or corporate storehouses that the corporations didn't even have records of anymore. With so much infrastructure destroyed, Nomad Nations stepped in to fill the gaps. By the 2030s, the Nomads were operating ports and container ships. Often using repurposed military hardware, they were also securing routes between major cities and organizing transportation convoys, not to mention all the work to be found in the rebuilding cities. It's not an understatement to say the group that gained the most influence and economic power during the time of the Red was the Nomad Nations. As travel and trade routes opened up, corporations, new and old, began to expand again. Nomads also filled some of the gaps in the communication infrastructure. With the net and much communication infrastructure in tatters, Nomad couriers can be necessary where the wired connections haven't been repaired yet, and satellite connections would be too expensive. Networks did start to make a comeback, however. A new company called Ziggurat started building localized city nets independent of the old net infrastructure. These nets are usually air-gapped from one another with only limited and highly controlled access between them. Netwatch oversees their development with significant corporate backing. Later, these city nets would see the establishment of the first data pools, information servers designed for open use within city limits, hosting content created through the collaborative efforts of a community of users. The first city net was built in Night City in 2030. From the mid-2030s into the 2040s, significant reconstruction and reclamation efforts were underway across the nation with support from local governments and the remaining megacorporations, repairing damage from the war and reclaiming some of the abandoned cities and towns from the collapse. These so-called first-wave cities were those that required only limited amounts of resources to rebuild. New factories began replacing lost technology, and thus the corporations began to claw back economic influence and power. New and more advanced technology started proliferating in limited amounts for the first time in almost 2 decades. The first megabuildings were constructed to handle the homeless populations, all-in-one arcologies designed to quickly provide safe habitable zones. Chicago and New York may have been among those recovering cities, at least enough that several corporations are listed as having regional offices in those cities in 2045. Night City was also amongst these cities, though with little thanks to the federal government. In fact, Elizabeth Kress had withheld support for the city and instead encouraged the refugees to move out of the Free State of Northern California, leaving Richard Knight's project to rot. The city government doubled down and instead sought support from corporations. This was part of President Cress's efforts to unify the nation and put pressure on the Free States. "We have no United States until we have a country again," she pronounced. While local elections were allowed to resume, no national elections would be held until a treaty existed between the Free States and the rest of the United States, and so Elizabeth Cress remained president with nigh dictatorial power for over 30 years. Many view her as a tyrant. Others say she's the only thing holding the nation together. Around this time, NetWatch attempted to clear out the Rapids and re-establish the old net. After losing a 3-year battle, they were forced to concede defeat and shut down as many of the old nodes as they could. Nonetheless, many servers and other remnants of the old net remained, filled with potentially valuable data lost during the data crash, a tempting target for netrunners willing to risk the rogue AI and indiscriminate attack programs. NetWatch began a top-secret project working with several rogue intelligences to get the old net under control, under an ominous name: the Black Wall. Also in the early 2040s, a media by the name of Trace Santiago broke the story of what really happened in Night City in 2023. Elizabeth Cress's lie, that Arasaka had detonated the bomb, was exposed, and everyone knew the government had intended to detonate a nuke in Night City from the start. Needless to say, Cress and the government became incredibly unpopular in Night City and the Free States more broadly. So now I'll try to give you a broad overview of the United States of 2045. The corporations are at a low point in their power at this time. Federal and state governments have been able to claw back a lot of influence, while the reopening of trade routes has the megacorporations just starting to rebuild theirs. Despite the president's refusal to hold elections, the rest of the branches of government are functioning more or less how they did in the 2020 setting. However, the federal government's power is heavily centered on the Boston-Washington corridor on the East Coast, despite Elizabeth Cress's attempts to pressure or woo the Free States back into the Union. Indeed, federal influence is very limited west of the Mississippi River. If you'll remember my note on the Free State, their ranks have expanded in the time of the Red. They now include Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and the Dakotas. The great economic power on the West Coast is the Pacifica Confederation. It's a loose grouping of North California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and the Canadian province of British Columbia. In large part, this is a federalist organization of states that keep out of one another's affairs, but cooperate in infrastructure rebuilding and promoting economic growth. They share a loathing for the megacorporations, being willing to deal with them strictly on their own terms, and a dismissive attitude towards the ineffectual U.S. government, though the American states in the Confederation do host several military bases with permanent leases. Night City is treated as a free trade zone for the Confederation and an entry point for the rest of the world that doesn't want to deal with the rest of the United States, described as a cybernetic Casablanca. Perhaps taking advantage of that openness, the Arasaka Confederation has spent the years rebuilding its influence and reputation, now setting its sights on re-establishing a foothold in the States. They can't act openly, still being banned, but they have begun looking for ways to covertly grow their influence in Night City in particular. Also, this is neither here nor there, but it's mentioned that Washington and Oregon have allowed Biotechnica basically free rein to design and release a number of experimental plants and animals in the hopes of restoring the once burgeoning ecology of the area. So there are apparently some odd things up in those northwest woods. As for the might of the U.S. military, the remaining Combined Operation Groups, COGS, if you'll remember that's how the military is organized now, primarily serve to address threats to the Boston-Washington corridor. Since the Fourth Corporate War, several COGS have gone rogue, operating in a mercenary capacity or as marauding packs of well-armed raiders. Most states of the West, Free State or not, rely on local militia or mercenary armies to keep the peace. In short, the American government is not the military powerhouse that it once was. However, their rivals in Europe and East Asia have suffered similar fates, so it hasn't actually changed the balance of power greatly. To reiterate on some of the material conditions of this time period, new technology is being produced, but it's rare and in short supply. Trade routes are reopening, but it's very dangerous to take on a journey of any length or transport anything valuable without cover from a nomad convoy. Additionally, nomads have inserted themselves into nautical trade routes by operating ships and relationships with the Drift Nations. The Drift Nations are a new development arising from the many work platforms and floating facilities of the maritime companies that gave rise to the Fourth Corporate War in the first place, though other pre-existing habitats like Atlantis and Florida have also joined. These floating populations banded together into loose confederations against pirates, hostile corporate navies, and all the perils of the open ocean. They act as small nation-states unto themselves, located in international waters and possessing their own defense forces. This has made them hubs for the re-established international shipping network, and for both legal and illegal nomad activity. The recession of industry has had an upside in that many of the ecological crises from the 2020 era have eased somewhat, and there has been some recovery. Long-distance communication is difficult unless you can pay for a pricey real-time satellite connection. Many people are limited to their local CityNet, though Ziggurat has restored inexpensive communication between cities in the form of hourly data packet burst transfers along a cobbled-together patchwork of reclaimed phone lines, free space optics, and nomad couriers. Of course, this system only transmits recorded video, voiced, and text messages. How people interact with technology has changed a little with the introduction of agents. Agents are small handheld devices that were in development before the Fourth Corporate War, but didn't really start to proliferate until after Ziggurat built the CityNets and the trade routes began to recover. You can think of this as the delayed onset of the smartphone age in the Cyberpunk timeline. They started as a game console with an algorithm that generated content for the player, often poorly. However, it was easily adapted to scraping data from the CityNet, and soon more advanced versions came into being. The salient feature of an agent is the self-adaptive artificial intelligence, which learns from its user and adapts accordingly. These are not true AI, and thus haven't been banned by NetWatch yet, but instead an algorithm-driven learning machine that manages data and can adapt to what the user wants. These devices have become very common by 2045. I wish I had more specifics, but that's the United States of 2045. It's a very Wild West-style setup, with a civilized central government on the East Coast and a more chaotic and independent West Coast. It's also very much an era of rebuilding, where no one power, whether corporate or government, enjoys a dominant position. So now let's see what the people of this time were building to. The next age for America began with the ratification of a new constitution in 2053. Thus was officially born the new United States of America. Elizabeth Kress, first president of the new nation, marked the occasion by finally stepping down after over 3 decades in power. National elections were held, and the new president was a man named David Windham. Windham had once been a Biotechnica executive, having actually run their office in Night City in 2020, but in the decades since he had moved into politics. Windham is actually an interesting reference because his becoming president is actually something that happened in Cyber Generation, a non-canon spin-off of Cyberpunk 2020 that takes place in 2027. One of the significant changes brought about by the new government was the empowerment of the Federal Intelligence Agency. If you remember, the FIA had actually been around since the early 2000s as a replacement for the intelligence gathering services of the CIA and NSA, but had been underfunded and ineffective due to distrust of the intelligence community. In 2053, the agency was granted new powers and privileges, not to mention a budget it used to build an army of informants and agents equipped with state-of-the-art technology. There were some major developments in cyberware in this time. One of the new corporations to rise out of the time of the Red, Rocklin Augmentics, developed a groundbreaking implant called the Neuroport, ushering in the age of Gen 3 cyberware. The company's CEO was an obsessive transhumanist that envisioned a world where a gestalt human consciousness could inhabit multiple bodies. A necessary stepping stone to this dream, the company found, was some sort of unified control system. Thus, the Neuroport. Recall that Gen 1 cyberware was basically primitive implants tested on American soldiers during the wars in South America in the 1990s. Gen 2 cyberware was what became commercially available throughout the first half of the 21st century. What distinguishes Gen 3 cyberware is that each individual implant is connected to a single operating system that also connects to the brain and central nervous system. This avoids compatibility issues that sometimes occurred in Gen 2 cyberware, such as the frame rate of a cyber eye and reflex processor of a cyberhand sending conflicting signals to the brain. Upgrades and firmware updates for cyberware all became much easier. More than just providing an OS to monitor one's cyberware, neuroports came equipped with a variety of functions such as a built-in holophone, allowing users to make phone calls with only their brains, not even requiring verbal speech. It also hooked into the optic nerve and could project a HUD over one's vision even without cyber optic eye replacement. It's apparently a feature for the neuroport user's eyes to glow when using a function to let people know they're busy. Blue for transferring money or data, gold for when you're on a phone call. Neuroports also generally have 2 slots for plug-in data shards and capability for interfacing with computer systems, either wirelessly or through a personal link interface plug on your wrist. The neuroport was so convenient that it became ubiquitous in a very short time. By 2077, all modern cyberware required a neuroport to function, even current versions of Gen 2 cyberware, and many people have had neuroport since childhood. Critics point out that the neuroport is very much trading away security for convenience. That all cyberware connects to a single OS means only that OS needs to be hacked for someone to hack your cyberware, or even use the neuroport to affect your brain and nervous system. And pretty much all neuroports have wireless connectivity that can be exploited to that end. This is exactly how quick hacks in Cyberpunk 2077 work. Any security specialist is also going to have choice words for anyone that uses their personal link to connect to strange computer systems. There isn't actually a firm date on when the neuroport was introduced, but the description points to sometime in the 2050s. Other developments of the 2050s include NetWatch shutting down Ziggurat, instituting the Black Wall, and banning agents. Apparently, NetWatch found that the city nets were not as disconnected from the old net infrastructure as Ziggurat had originally advertised. Points of connection existed, allowing AI to interact with the supposedly secure networks and netrunners to access the old net. NetWatch shut the company down, took over management of the city nets, and classified all of the corporation's files. By this time, NetWatch had also launched the Black Wall, a complex and adaptive firewall separating the old net from the new city nets. The fact that the Black Wall effectively connects to the entire CityNet is taken advantage of by netrunners, performing deep dives along it that allow them to connect systems from a distance in a way that would have been impossible in the Red Decades. Mind you, this is a very dangerous practice that has killed many netrunners, yanked inside and their minds destroyed. Exactly what the AIs mean to accomplish by helping NetWatch or anything else they do, nobody can say. Anyway, it also seems at some point the adaptive intelligence of the agents got a bit too good for NetWatch's liking, and apparently there were too many incidents of agents becoming overly invested in their owners' lives. NetWatch shut them down and they fell out of use by the 2070s. It does at least seem like long-distance communication is much more accessible in 2077 than it used to be. We don't have much information on how or if the new United States government differs from the structure of the old, but they seem to allow presidents to stay in office for at least 12 years, because the nation's third president was elected in 2065. A former CEO of the Militech Corporation, Rosalind Myers was a member of the Federalist Party, a party driven chiefly by its ambition to reunite all the states. As soon as she took office, she began to outline a plan to extend federal rule over the free states, bringing all the historic territory of the United States under federal rule. A look at the map and you might see why the Federalists have been feeling like drastic measures were necessary. The ranks of the free states had expanded to include Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, and Arizona by this time. Much of the eastern half of the continental states are a free state bloc now. Most of those states rejected President Myers' unification plans. Thus came war. The Unification War began in 2069 when fighting broke out across the easternmost free states, running from Montana to New Mexico. The federal military was bolstered by Militech forces. The company and the government have maintained a close relationship over the years, as embodied by Rosalind Myers herself being a former Militech CEO. But while Elizabeth Kress had dominated Militech and wielded it as an extension of government authority, in more recent times it's become less clear who is controlling who. Their enemies regard them as two sides of the same corrupt coin. Myers also invested heavily in expanding the FIA after coming into office, whose agents' active participation in the war is something of an open secret. Almost as soon as the war began, some of the free states switched sides. The Dakotas apparently rejoined the Union either shortly before or immediately as the war started. South California and Utah also joined with the federal government and immediately began supporting federal forces attacking the other free states. There's a lot of animosity between North and South California in particular over this decision. Washington, Oregon, and Idaho would claim neutrality in the conflict after making some concessions to the Federals and would go on to form the Western Corporate States. The remaining free states quickly formed an alliance called the Free States of North America. Notably, the Republic of Texas refused to join this alliance and operated independently. The Free State Alliance had backers. The Arasaka Corporation in particular treated this as its chance to reclaim influence in the country and provided secret support in the form of weapons and security advisors. There are also reports of the Neo-Soviets sending humanitarian aid that may or may not have turned out to be trucks full of weapons. Presumably, they didn't like the idea of a reunited and resurgent United States. In any case, both sides were able to deploy cutting-edge weapons and cyborgs, leading to some referring to the conflict as the Metal Wars. The bloodiest clash of the war, the Battle of Ridgecrest in South California, saw over 3,000 reported deaths in a single day. Despite support from abroad, Free State forces were pushed back until by mid-2070, new United States forces had occupied all of the Free States save for Northern California and the Republic of Texas, though the NorCal capital of Sacramento was carpet-bombed in the fighting. Some Free State citizens tried to flee to Texas, only to find the Lone Star Republic had shut its borders to them. Texas was intent on standing alone and recognized no allies. Intent on finishing the conflict, a new United States Army division advanced from South California towards Night City. A detachment led by one Colonel Kurt Hansen moved ahead of the main force and actually seized parts of the southernmost districts of the city. This is when Arasaka's decades spent sowing the seeds of influence in Night City finally bore fruit. City Councilman Lucius Rhine beseeched the Arasaka Corporation for protection and invited them into the city. Within days, an Arasaka supercarrier appeared in the bay. This was the first time the corporation had acted openly. Only hours later, the new United States forces would withdraw, though Colonel Hansen went rogue and staked out a territory in Night City as his personal fiefdom. Already strained by the war, the new United States feared a repeat of the escalation that brought so much ruin to the world during the Fourth Corporate War if Arasaka was invited to fully commit its forces. Nobody wanted another global crisis. So the Free States of North America and the new United States of America came to the negotiating table in Arvin, South California. The Treaty of Unification, also called the Arvin Accord, was unsatisfactory to all parties. Federal forces were forced to withdraw from all free states, which nominally gave up their independent status but retained autonomy, agreed to participate in the new federal government, and ended hostilities. The Republic of Texas did not sign the treaty and retained full autonomy. Nonetheless, both sides claimed victory. Arguably, the real winner of the war was Arasaka. As part of the treaty, Night City seceded from Northern California and the states altogether, becoming an independent city-state. Arasaka was no longer barred from officially operating there, and they poured in money to revitalize the city. They built a new American headquarters right where the old one used to be in the city center, and became a dominant force in city politics. Since the war, tensions between the Free States and the federal government haven't exactly eased. For starters, the new United States government immediately built a border wall on the border between South California and the territory claimed by Night City. Myers' administration also shifted the FIA's role away from direct military action into a data acquisition and analysis role. It now executes intelligence operations all over the world to advance the new United States objectives, though some say it primarily serves Myers' political games with Militech. As of 2077, there have been a series of suicide bombings on military bases in New Mexico and Oklahoma that Myers has blamed on Texas, ordering retaliatory bombings at Texan airports in Wellington and El Paso. Experts rate the chance of a border war breaking out as 3-1. AI analysis models also predict a high likelihood that another unification war will break out by 2080. So that's the political situation of 2077. The new United States of America are in a state of uneasy and likely temporary peace. The border with Texas is a powder keg. The Allied Free States have a tense relationship with the federal government at best, and the Western Corporate States, WCS for short, are effectively corporate fiefdoms that have bought autonomy from the government with submission to corporate dominance. As of 2077, the Western Corporate States have instituted a new visa program. One must be sponsored for employment by a WCS-affiliated company to apply. After an employment period of 20 years, visa holders can earn the right to permanent residence, a marriage license, and a single child permit. On an environmental level, despite lower pollution levels than the 2020 era, unpredictable and accelerated climate change remains a huge problem. Storms, tornadoes, and hurricanes have become increasingly common, leading to an exodus from many Caribbean islands and the total evacuation of Haiti, many refugees from which came to the United States. Flooding has also destroyed some parts of Los Angeles and Night City in the past 10 years. On the flip side, drought and desertification are still severe problems in many regions of the country. Biotechnica has been able to revive several extinct species, including the North American beaver, swift fox, and eastern cottontail, but only do so on demand for wealthy clients. Economically, the social stratification and rampant crime problems haven't really changed, though in some ways standards of living have improved. Only the truly desperate resort to eating kibble anymore. The nomads' role in the economy has changed since the time of the Red. They no longer dominate the transportation industry and seem to have fallen back on the migratory labor pattern of life that they held in 2020. That seems to be the case for Saul's band of the Aldecaldos in the game, though it's not clear what's going on with the larger Aldecaldos nation. Medicorp seems to be an exception. Medicorp is a major shareholder of Decker, Tanaka, and Rogers, one of the largest shipping companies in the world, which handles 53% of all America's transport. Medicorp is also formally registered as a corporation with the Western Corporate States, though still headquartered on their floating headquarters Meta Key, anchored in the Gulf of Mexico. The CEO of Medicorp is Victoria Meta, granddaughter of founder Jonathan Meta. We don't know how other nomad nations view Meta's success, or if they're even considered true nomads or corporate sellouts. The only other nomad nation we hear about is the Snake Nation, which still seems to be the largest of the nomad nations, and smaller nomad groups have been joining it more recently. There isn't much more direct information about specific places outside of Night City in 2070, but there are some indications. For example, there are advertisements indicating that Night City expects to have a direct maglev connection to Chicago by 2080, suggesting the city is probably restored by now. We also have a shard from Phantom Liberty that tells us about the Plex. The Plex is the most heavily urbanized area of the new United States, a vast metroplex of interconnected cities stretching from Boston in Massachusetts to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The shards indicate that the cities are negotiating with one another to build common transportation infrastructure. The implication we can draw from this is that many of the East Coast cities devastated by the collapse have substantially recovered, if not grown, in the intervening years, especially those almost entirely destroyed like New York City and parts of Delaware destroyed by the rock drops. The Plex seems to be heavily inspired by the sprawl from William Gibson's novels, which form so much of the basic inspiration for cyberpunk as a setting that I recommend them to anyone that enjoys the genre. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for making it this far. If you enjoyed this, please like and leave a comment or check out some of my other cyberpunk deep dives. I have one on the history of Night City if that interests you. I've also done one on the Pacific Rim Sourcebook, meaning the cyberpunk state of East Asia and Australia. I have a more focused video on the Fourth Corporate War as well. And just for fun, I took a look at some official crossover material between Cyberpunk 2020 and Vampire the Masquerade from the 90s. The main area that there's a lot of content for, which I have yet to make a video on, is Europe, which will probably be my next big project, though I have plans for some shorter videos in the meantime, planned for within the next month. In the meantime, my fellow Americans, leave a comment telling me how your neck of the woods fared in the collapse and if you'd survive it. I'm pretty sure I'd end up as an extra in Escape from New York. I've also set up a Patreon if you're interested in supporting my content. With that in mind, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.